The highway leading through the wooded area from the village to the main highway was in fairly good condition. But John, who was sitting behind the wheel, didn't press the gas. Even though the bends of the road were not too steep, but he, as an experienced driver, was well aware of how sad the consequences of a sudden appearance of a wild animal in front of the car could be. So the man, having taken the passenger to a cozy remote village, leisurely returned to the city. Besides, it was quite possible to finish the work for today. After all, this order went surprisingly smoothly and brought excellent tips. The amount is quite comparable to the cost of the trip. The elderly passenger, who was helped into the car by a restless young girl, turned out to be very pleasant. At first, the lady, to whom the word old lady did not fit, was reading something on her smartphone, and then she began to look thoughtfully at the landscape outside the cab window. For fun, John sometimes tried to guess the occupation of the person he was helping to comfortably travel by car. Of course, such distractions from the road did not happen too often. But when the situation permitted, the driver allowed himself an innocent amusement and was often right in his guesses. And today he was sneaking glances at the passenger. He began to speculate. Her clothes were nice and fairly new. Her hair was impeccable, even after the woman had pulled back the hood of her light cloak. Understated makeup, some kind of peculiarly straight posture. The woman noticed that the cabbie was looking at her and gave him a direct stare, as if looking straight into his soul. John felt uncomfortable and hastily clarified. Should I change the temperature or leave it at that? The passenger's well-practiced voice was soft, but clear and coherent. Thank you. Everything is fine. John was wondering who this woman with a royal posture, towering in the back seat of his car. He also thought that the passenger, like his mother, had devoted many years of her life to the difficult work of a teacher. Except that the deference and fidgetiness shown by the young escort hinted at a higher status. Maybe the old lady had advanced in her career to the position of school principal, or had been a famous actress or singer in the past. However, the look of this passenger seemed to reject the possibility of extraneous conversations in advance. From the very beginning, John thought that the passenger was a retired judge. He had already had encounters with people of this profession in his life, and frankly speaking, he disliked them. They decide the fates, often without delving into the circumstances of cases, acting quite unjustly. And all this under cover of numbers of articles of laws. Ugh, they think they're gods. When the lady first came out of the entrance, she seemed arrogant, and the driver even felt something very close to inexplicable dislike. Very soon, however, John's impression changed to the opposite. Observing the passenger's behavior, he realized that she was sharply different from those to whom everyone around him is eternally indebted. The woman gently calmed down the girl who was fussily helping her, who had managed to drop one of the bulky bags and was loudly lamenting about the forgotten item. The lady said a polite hello to him, to what a far cry from her customers, and reassuringly wished the remaining assistant a good end to her day. It would seem that these were trifles, manifestations of elementary courtesy and nothing more. For some reason, however, these details pleased John. Here was the end of the trip, which had passed almost in complete silence, when the car had already entered the village. As the car approached its destination, the man saw a radiant smile flicker across the passenger's lips and instantly transform her face. The car passed a boy walking along the curb with a shaggy dog on a leash. This couple, obviously pleased with each other's company, was apparently either familiar to the lady or evoked some pleasant memories. Having parked the car in the specified place, John helped the passenger to take things out of the trunk and wanted to offer to carry them. But a very young boy, running from the gate, beat him to it. After giving the cabbie a hostile look, the young man began to pull out the bags. The lady handed John a few bills and thanked him from the bottom of her heart. Thank you, a wonderful trip. You drive the car perfectly, as if you could feel it like a living thing. Goodbye. Honesty prevented John from taking the outstretched money, he reported. Actually, your trip has already been paid for non-cash, so have a good day. The woman smiled. I know it's for you personally. Dispose of it as you see fit. Go home early, get some rest or something. While I was driving, I read about the cute custom of paying for the next person in the coffee shop. It's called a suspended coffee. Meanwhile, the nimble young man, who was still casting suspicious glances at John, carried all of his belongings and respectfully extended his hand to help me up the steps. The passenger once more offered to the driver. Take it, It would really be fun if you could help someone in need to get where they need to go. Good luck to you." John did not refuse and thanked the woman, said goodbye, and drove off. Dusk was just beginning to fall, and the road was a little faded after the recent rain. There was no point in driving with the gas pedal to the floor. No one was waiting for him at the rented apartment. His mother lived in another city and flatly refused to move. It was as if she had put down roots at her job at the school, an institution familiar to every corner, which for several years had been threatened to be overhauled. But the volume of this event was so large that even during the long summer vacation was not to cope. So it turned out that in some offices his mother literally knew every nail in the face. After all, she, together with colleagues and parents, many of whom had to teach, repaired classrooms and corridors, not relying on the generosity of the budget. Her mother had long hinted to her only son that he should move in with her, but John was ashamed to return to his homeland. It seemed to him that the ubiquitous and chatty gossipers would teach and remind him of what he himself had tried so hard to forget. Really, how could one be proud of such a sad experience? Especially when your mother had spent her whole life teaching her children goodness, light, eternal values. These thoughts, which again, uninvited, appeared in his head, made the cab driver's mood worsen. After all, he had not gone to prison because he was a criminal. He hadn't hurt anyone. It was only John's fault for being too gullible that he had to do the time. How proud his mother, father, and wife had been when he'd managed to get a job in a bank after graduation. And how much grief had this supposed good fortune brought to their family. John diligently went into all the nuances of the work and acted strictly according to the job description, but did not notice how he was the only suspect in the organization of a large-scale crime. The cunning manager managed to twist the ongoing investigation in such a way as to get away with it, and John was unable to prove his innocence. The lawyer seemed to try to build a defense, but without success. The father died of a heart attack shortly after learning of the verdict for his only son. His adoring wife, Jennifer, decided to divorce him. Only his mother waited for him and fought for her son to leave the prison walls as soon as possible. After his release, of course, John had a hard time. He didn't get a good job, so he had to make do with casual labor, and then decided that the only more or less reliable hope for stability and financial independence is his ability to drive a car. Thanks to his father, who taught him the wisdom of driving and car care starting almost from kindergarten, having issued a new license to replace the expired ones. The unlucky former bank clerk and ex-convict became a cab driver. Relationships with women somehow did not add up, and in his 30s the man became an inveterate bachelor. To the prospective grooms he could not be attributed, because the wealth of John, of course, could not boast. In addition, purposefully looking for his happiness, he just did not want to. Long betrayal of his wife was still an unhealed wound. Small love affairs ended in separation, and John was not too broken about his loneliness. His mother, rapidly losing her health, was the only person he lived for now. John sent her money regularly, and in the fall he came to help her buy vegetables for the winter. It had only been a couple weeks. How he had parted from his mother after another brief encounter, but the man missed her desperately again. How good and peaceful he felt when she stroked his head as if in passing, or carefully adjusted his blanket when he was on the verge of sleep. But John couldn't afford to stay in his hometown and have everyone pointing fingers at his mother or himself. He was afraid he would lose his temper, punish the gossipers and abusers, and go back to prison. No, it was better to come for a few days, and then hide from gossip and worried looks in a metropolis alien in spirit and mood, where no one is interested in anyone. Here, even about neighbors on the landing is not known. And John was happy and completely satisfied with it. And having caught up with his memories, the cab driver tried to switch to other thoughts, but there were practically no positive ones among them. The leisurely return to the city was a good time to think about the incidents that had happened to him during the years he had been working in the cab. Not all the passengers had been as complacent as the elegant lady who had left the cab a short time ago. They had tried to rip John off, and they had tried to run away from the car without paying. The stretch of road through the woods had long since ended. A little more, and ahead would appear a series of dacha settlements, which were especially picturesque in spring and early fall. Almost immediately after them, about 15 minutes away, the house where John had rented an apartment would appear. Not so long ago, the traffic had been incredibly heavy, but now that the harvest was almost over and only a few late apples were hanging, the cottages looked abandoned and deserted, and the road was almost empty. John wanted to pass through these not very cheerful places. But suddenly, as he passed one of the stops, he noticed a figure lying on a bench. Nearby was a wheeled cart, a sure sign of experienced dacha dwellers, who, like industrious ants, haul the crops from their dachas to their city apartments. The cab driver did not consider himself an evil person, but he caught himself thinking that the first thing he wanted to do was to press the gas pedal. However, having figured out that the season, when the municipality runs public transport to dachas, was already over, he realized that a stranger could not hope for a shuttle bus to arrive. John carefully slowed down, parked the car on the side of the road to find out maybe the man became ill, needs medical help, or just needs to get to the city. After all, no one was waiting for him at home, and the words of a recent passenger suddenly popped into his head. John got out of the car, stretched his legs a little, and approached the bench. For a second, the cab driver felt uneasy, because the man didn't react to the knocking of the door or the sound of footsteps. "Hey, buddy," John called out. "Are you all right? Alive or what?" The body moved. Then the man turned, sat down on the bench, and looked at the cab driver. John saw before him not a man at all, but a rather young girl, and he looked at the stranger with surprise. Her clothes were even worse than those which country people wear to visit their plots, and were more like those of a scarecrow. The old-fashioned jacket, which was fashionable to wear 30 years ago, was clearly too big for the girl, and the knitted hat pulled low on her forehead looked visibly shabby. The image was completed by the sneakers, which had obviously seen a lot in their lifetime. All in all, the stranger looked like a vagrant or a beggar, like those who sat at church gates. John was in no hurry to draw conclusions. There was no telling what might have happened to the girl's normal clothes. Maybe she had to wear things exiled to the country estate due to some insurmountable circumstances. There was no odor of alcohol. Yes, and in general, the stranger had too clear a look. Trying not to frighten her, John began to speak soothingly. "I don't know if you know or not, but there will definitely be no dacha bus. I listen to the radio all the time, and they said on the news that the season is over. So if you are going to the city, I can give you a ride." In the eyes of the stranger was clearly visible fear, and at the same time there was a desire to be in a cozier place than this wind-blown stop. And in a hoarse voice the girl confessed, "It would be nice to get to town, but I have money only for a loaf of bread." "Don't you have money to pay for it?" John could not help but laugh at the amazing coincidence, and hurried to explain the situation to the stranger, who seemed about to run away. "By happy coincidence, it turned out that your trip has already been paid for by my recent passenger. Especially since I'm going into town myself. It's not all about the money. Sometimes it's good to show a little humanity. Why don't I give you a ride on the way?" The girl's look was still distrustful, and the man, who himself wanted to get home as soon as possible, and not to stand on the highway, experiencing the gusts of the rising wind, had to hurry her. "Here, decide whether you're going or not. I'm not going to hurt you in any way, by the way. If you believe me, let's get in the car and go." "Well, there's no judgment. Maybe some other kind driver will feel sorry for you." The stranger rose abruptly from the bench, picked up her wheeled bag, and answered the cab driver. "I'm ready." On the way to the car, John noticed that his companion was obviously cold, although maybe she was shivering from excitement. The cab driver didn't bother to find out why, but simply turned on the heater and concentrated on the road. The passenger, who sat in the front seat next to him, placed her bag in her legs, fastened her seatbelt, and seemed to disconnect from reality. John didn't talk to the stranger, and she didn't talk either. Only when the car was almost entering the city, the man specified, "Where should I take you?" The girl shuddered, as if breaking out of a stupor, and after a few seconds, clearly thinking something over, answered, "Now there will be a 24-hour stall and I can go out. Or, if it's not too much trouble, turn right, and I'll be there in 2 blocks. John was a little confused about the destination. As far as he understood his passenger, she was going to one of the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. A neighborhood built up with temporary housing for workers who were erecting a series of factories. It had lasted much longer than planned in the city, but was now living out its last days. Most of the residents were happy to leave the barracks with minimal amenities. Judging by the numerous houses with lit roofs, the centralized heating had already been turned off, and the dwellings had gone to people who simply had nowhere else to live. The residents of this neighborhood almost never used cab services, unless they were plotting to take the proceeds. Strangely enough, the girl didn't look like a criminal or socially depressed. Literate speech, noticeable even by short lines, clearly practiced observance of traffic rules and manners in general indicated that the passenger was hardly a native of this suburb. Having decided that if to do good, then not half, John did not slow down at the stall, as if he had been transported by time machine from the dashing 90s, when the country was in ruins and the cruel laws of survival came into force. Obeying the girl's instructions, he took her where she asked. There was no limit to the man's surprise. The place where his passenger needed to go was not even a house, but actually a ruin. A woman, whose clothes looked even worse than John's, came out of a leaning door, apparently having heard the noise of the car. The girl, having quickly uttered words of gratitude, slipped out of the interior of the car. The cab driver was ready to start from his seat, when he suddenly saw the woman slapping the cheeks of his recent passenger. Then the inhabitant of the dilapidated building began to pull her bag with one hand, without stopping slapping her. The girl did not make any attempt to actively defend herself and simply hid back, but did not let go of her burden. Sighing and mentally cursing himself, John got out of the car, taking his trusty tire iron with him, and went to rescue the girl. She didn't even react to the appearance of the voluntary defender. But the woman with a saintly beaten face began pouring profanity on the man, generously inserting into her swear words the slang typical of people who had been in places not so remote. This was the first time John was glad that he himself had passed the test of prison time, and he quickly explained to the fierce woman that she was wrong. The man asked the girl, "Are you staying here, or are we going farther?" The young stranger angrily snatched her bag from her hands and walked toward the car. John followed her but turned around several times, expecting anything. Fortunately, the precautions were unnecessary, and soon the cab quietly left the scene of the recent ugly scene. The girl did not cry, but sat tense and sometimes shuddered when the car bounced on the bumps, which were plentiful on the outskirts of the city. Silently handing the passenger wet wipes, John concentrated on the road and then offered, "There's a social shelter on the other side of town. They help people in difficult circumstances. If you want, I'll take you there. They have strict rules, but every point is absolutely fair. You can't bring any booze with you. That's the most important condition. And they'll make you work too, but you don't have to pay any money. Contributions are only on a voluntary basis, and they can be made even after a difficult period of life left behind. They helped me out a lot in my time. If it hadn't been for their support, it is unlikely that I would have been able to quickly get out of the hole in my life." The female passenger whispered so quietly that John didn't hear and asked again, "I'm sorry, I didn't understand." The girl repeated, but louder, "Are you tired? So don't think about me. Just give me the address of this shelter and I'll get there myself." John looked at his watch and began to think out loud. "Of course, I could invite you to my place without a second thought. But I live in a rented apartment, and the landlord is strictly forbidden to bring strangers without his prior approval. Look, why don't I drive you to the shelter? There's always someone on duty there, and if you're lucky, someone you know. They'll help you get checked in quickly. Do you have your papers?" The girl nodded in time with the doggy on the dashboard, and realizing that the cab driver's kindness had long since gone beyond the simple desire to give a hitchhiker a ride, began to thank him confusedly. Interrupting the flow of thanks, John asked, "Listen, what's your name, Emily?" "Emily," the passenger whispered. The cabbie hummed at this unexpected correction and introduced himself in response. "Well, I'm John. That's how we met. So pardon the imposition, Emily. But I'm going to ask you a question that's been bothering me. What are some of the sins you just got slapped for?" Even in the encroaching darkness, somewhat dispersed by the glowing instruments, it was noticeable in the parlor how embarrassed the girl was. "That's a long explanation. And to make a long story short, I didn't bring any money or groceries. And in general, I left with my documents, which is strictly forbidden. I myself do not understand why I went back there. I don't know why I went back there." John asked again, "Is that your home there? Or is it some kind of voluntary slavery?" The cab driver didn't wait for Emily's answer, because the girl cried, interrupting the silence with sobs. John parked outside the store and turned to the passenger. "You sit here. I'll go get some groceries. I don't feel comfortable driving empty-handed. Help is always welcome there." Emily didn't even seem to notice John's words. He returned, loaded the bags into the back seat, and the girl had already calmed down and even apologized. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. My nerves are a little frayed." The cab driver nodded, letting her know that he understood, and when he had already driven Emily to a well-known shelter, he dared to bother her again. Everyone made it. John took his bag, and they went to get Emily settled in for the night. Afterward, she would decide where she wanted to go. To John's delight, a good friend of his was on duty at the shelter that evening. The old woman opened the door and greeted his former ward cordially. "Oh, John, it's been a long time. What brings you to our land? Still working as a driver? Don't you get bored? Come in, darling. I've just made some tea. Take your time. Sit with the old lady, tell her the news." John, putting the bags on the floor, hugged the woman who had always treated him in a motherly way. And she, still talking, noticed a crying girl behind the ajar door and stretched out. "Yes, I see you didn't just drop in to see me or bring some goodies. Come on in and tell me what happened." The cab driver introduced his passenger to the shelter attendant on duty. "Here's our Deborah. I was lucky, although everyone here is a wonderful person. But I'll tell you in confidence that Deborah is the best. There are no unsolvable problems for her, and she always finds wise words to support and comfort. Deborah. And this is Emily. I only met her today, but as far as I can tell, she clearly needs a roof over her head. At least for tonight. And of course your advice, as always, will come in handy." The attendant led the guests into the kitchen, and as she sorted through the packages, she had time to run errands for John and Emily. "Emily, if there are any papers, let me see them. And you, John, take a set of clothes for Emily from the pantry. We keep all sorts of things, and show her where she can wash up. And if she wants to, she can take a shower too." While Emily cleaned herself up, the nimble Deborah set the table with John's help, persuading her former ward to eat dinner as well, scolding him unmercifully. "I know you probably haven't had anything hot but coffee today. I poured both Emily and you some delicious chicken soup with homemade noodles. Let's sit down and have a quiet dinner. Then we can talk. It won't do any good on an empty stomach." Emily, washed and changed, looked even more youthful than she had in the tramp's clothes, which Deborah, with her permission, had already taken to the small room equipped as a laundry. Her passport said she was only 18, but she didn't look it. The overly curious residents of the orphanage who stopped by the kitchen to see who had come to visit so late, Deborah gently sent them to their rooms. "I realize there's not much entertainment here, but we're not here for a performance. You'll get to know each other tomorrow." The woman was obeyed unquestioningly, and she continued to treat John and Emily. When the guests had had enough, Deborah tactfully clarified. "Emily, I realize you don't feel too comfortable right now. You think I'm going to interrogate you. But trust me, you have the right to tell me as much as you feel you need to. If you don't want to say anything at all, that's okay. Sometimes it takes time." But it seemed as if the girl wanted to say something herself. She began her story by thanking John. "Thank you for picking me up at the bus stop. And then when they saw the ugly scene, they didn't leave me to my fate. They brought me here, where I finally made myself look like a human being. I decided at the bus stop that I'd rather be here than go on living this pointless life. And then you showed up, like an angel, even though I didn't deserve to be saved. I came to this cottage for a reason. I thought there was no one there anymore. And I was caught. It's good that the women who detained me didn't call the police and didn't beat me up. They just let me go. They even gave me some apples, but strictly ordered me not to appear in that dacha village again. So I lay down on the bench, feeling ashamed and bitter. Although the weather was not hot, I was terribly embarrassed about the fate I had arranged for myself. Deborah, who had listened to hundreds of confessions, was silent, realizing that the girl was preparing to tell the details of how she had become homeless. John decided to be supportive with words and encouragement. "So you're still very young, Emily. There's time to make things right, however." The cab driver's words had an unexpected effect on Emily. The girl cried, but without hysterical sobs. Then she explained to John and Deborah, who had arrived. "I have already regretted 1,000 times the things I did 6 months ago. It all started when I met Michael. A funny, charming guy, I thought at the time. After classes at the institute, he met me while we were walking home. So entertained me that my stomach ached from laughter. Then I fell head over heels in love with him and started skipping school. What kind of classes could there be when spring was raging and the guy was asking for meetings? Of course. My parents strongly discouraged me from hanging out with Michael. My father said that my favorite is some kind of murky, asked me to give time to collect all available information about Michael and even a little more. My mom begged to listen to my dad's idea too, saying that she had a bad feeling about it and that my obsession with Michael worried her. She hinted and even said outright that he was an Alfonso and would break my heart by betraying me. But I only believed the one I loved. Michael was so convincing that he loved me. Of course I believed him. Not my parents' suspicions. Some usurer of doubts appeared, but I was quick to deal with him. In response to my direct question as to whether his interest was self-serving, Michael even took offense and disappeared for a few days. I was so hurt that once he reappeared, apologized and started kissing me. I fell in love with him even more. My lover and I started meeting secretly because he lived in a hostel and there was nowhere to bring me. About meeting Michael's parents was out of the question. They lived in another state, and my lover planned that when he had a vacation, we would go to them together, in my hometown. I was terrified to appear with Michael in crowded places, so that my parents would not find out about the continuation of the relationship. Amelia, a longtime friend of my mom's, was so supportive. She even gave me her own apartment to go out with Michael, said I was old enough to make my own life. I couldn't keep the secret about the meetings for long. One day I came home, and it was announced to me in an ultimatum form that this connection must necessarily be cut off. I did not give in. The quarrels in our apartment grew more and more frequent, and it smelled of sedatives. I showed up there less and less often, though. Sometimes only to sleep over if Amelia's apartment was occupied. My mom was giving me a hard time. Dad threatened to withdraw his financial support. And I was already making plans for married life with the man I loved. I was convinced that I was old enough to have a serious conversation with my foster parents, and it was time to figure things out and live my life. How betrayed and hurt I felt. How so? Because not only had my parents lied to me all my life, but they also wanted to take away my love now. You bought me like a toy and kept me away from my own mother, playing the role of benefactors. I don't know what I was thinking, but it was clearly not in my right mind that I came to the apartment where my childhood had passed. And instead of having a calm conversation, I began to reproach those whom I thought were my parents and curse them for their lies. Emily cried quietly, repeating that she had always wished me well. John sat with a defeated look on his face, then left for the kitchen, probably to avoid listening to my accusations. The woman who had taken me to daycare treated me, taught me lessons, had tears rolling down her cheeks, but those incessant drops didn't touch me at all. I managed to get my real mother Deborah's address from her. John came back with 2 glasses filled with a stinking liquid that smelled like valerian, and almost forced us to drink the sedative. I continued to play the accuser. You're used to buying everything, but money doesn't make you gods who are allowed to decide everything for others, I shouted. My mom did something to calm me down, or maybe it was the sedative. I turned around and went to my room. That was the last night I saw the people who had raised me. During the night, I packed up some of my things, all the jewelry I'd given them, and, in what I now repent, I took the money. My parents never hid their savings from me, they trusted me. And then I even justified myself that it was a moral compensation to me for their lies and interference in my relationship with Michael. Without even leaving a note, I left the apartment. I had 2 goals: to find my birth mom, Deborah, and start a happy new life with her, my brothers and sisters I had been separated from, and of course with Michael. I was not even frightened by the prospect of moving to another city, because my beloved will find work everywhere. I believed that, and I didn't feel bad about dropping out of school. Why would I need a diploma if I had to sacrifice my love for it? I was sure that my lover would support me, so I called him. We met. I confusedly explained what had happened. I invited him to come with me to search for my biological mom, to support me in a difficult moment. But he apologized, saying he had to be at work in the next few days. Michael comforted me, promising to stay in touch. We also agreed that he would find us a rented apartment with the money from my parents' inheritance. I left a little for the road, and the rest of the rather large sum, and a bag of jewelry I gave Michael, so as not to lose it. After a heated embrace, we parted. It's long to tell how much and by what means I had to search for my birth mom. Fortunately, I had money and rented a room in a nice cozy hostel. I called Michael every day. He sent me photos of apartments for approval. But our conversations were short, a few minutes each. My favorite explained all the hard work and careful selection of our future family nest, and I, tired of fruitless searches, was not the best conversationalist. My biological mom, as it turned out, had managed to change her place of residence several times. And of course, I noticed that the neighborhood was becoming less and less prestigious with each move. After about a week of searching, I reached the dilapidated house where you, John, drove me today. I had accomplished my goal and finally met my birth mom. Strangely enough, she recognized me as soon as I opened the door. "My golden one," she screamed. "My baby girl, my darling. I've been waiting for you to find me someday." We cried for a long time, sitting in each other's arms, unable to talk. Mom confessed that she considered parting with me the worst mistake, for which she had to pay a heavy price. She didn't go into details, but it was obvious that she was addicted to alcohol. When my mom admitted that of my 2 brothers and 3 sisters, none of them were in touch with her. I, of course, immediately suggested that she move in with me. Mom agreed. In high spirits, I told Michael about the long-awaited meeting and asked him to find a bigger apartment. At first, he seemed to share my emotions, congratulated me, rejoiced, but the next day he stopped contacting me. It was impossible to call him, and I was worried that something had happened to him. I couldn't find a place for myself. I didn't have any close, trusted friends, so I called Amelia. Instead of support and help, I received recriminations and accusations. A friend of my foster mom's told me that tragedy had struck. The man I thought was my father had suffered a stroke and was in the hospital. Amelia recounted the circumstances that led to his stroke. It turned out he had gone to the police to file a theft report against me, but hit a tree on the way. My foster dad suddenly felt sick. Fortunately, the speed was low and there were no other casualties. Amelia said that her friend, my foster mother, called me an ungrateful creature, a creep who was the reason my entire well-being was ruined. I didn't have the strength to object. In my heart, I knew that all the insults were well-deserved. I asked Amelia for the number of the hospital, but she strictly forbade me not only to come to town, but even to contact my foster mother. She claimed it would only make things worse and could take away her friend's health as well. Amelia begged me not to call the foster mom, lest she be sent to a hospital bed or, God forbid, to the next world. Hearing me sobbing into the phone, Amelia softened and promised to let me know when the situation was more favorable. She also agreed to go to Michael's dorm to see if anything bad had happened to him. I waited impatiently for news. Soon I heard from Amelia that Michael had been offered a lucrative 6-month shift, and he had left, leaving some of his belongings behind. I calmed down a little, so my lover was fine, and anything could have happened to the phone. I'd called Amelia about once a month for 6 months now, but she asked me not to disturb the people I'd disappointed. I asked her to tell her on my behalf that I was sorry, but she said I was not yet forgiven. I asked if I could come, and she said it was too soon. The foster father needs to get stronger and the mother needs to calm down. Michael still hasn't contacted me, even though by my reckoning he should be back by now. I have to admit, I'm beginning to suspect that he won't even show up. More and more often I think that he turned out to be a fraud and, having embezzled the money and jewelry received from me, just decided to hide. Not only that, but my relationship with my biological mother began to deteriorate as I ran out of money. I sold my smartphone and bought a simple phone instead. But of course that's not enough. The biological mother works unofficially. Or rather, she's trying to work until she gets fired for absenteeism. She set me up to sort of support her. In addition, there were fights because her roommate started to show interest in me. So she tries to see me less at home. And today she sent me to the cottage to clean up the mess. The fact that I came by car made my mother mad, and John witnessed the ugly scene. She slapped me in the face. When she heard that I hadn't managed to bring anything from the cottage, she started to take away my bag. I had my cell phone and passport in it, so I clutched at the handle like a drowning man clutching at straws. These things were my last hope that everything would work out, my last link to the people who were really close to me. It's a good thing you, John, didn't go and get me out of there. I myself realize how wrong I was to take money from people from whom I saw only kindness and care. It turns out they were right about Michael, too. I wish I'd believed them and hurt them by doing that. It was her own fault. But the punishment the foster parents received for their kindness was completely unfair. If Emily had been a little braver, she would have gotten down on her knees and started apologizing. But she feared that they really had cut her out of their lives and didn't want to see her. Even more, she feared that her father would be made worse by her appearance, especially since she couldn't pay back the money she'd taken. Emily was silent. Michael didn't say anything either. Deborah shook her head and didn't beat around the bush. The girl had made a mess of things. But I'm not judging. A young crush can sometimes push even much wiser people into rash behavior. You know, Michael, Emily is absolutely right to apologize to the people who raised her. I understand that she fears their reaction, but it's better to apologize in person to their faces than to cowardly make excuses through an outsider, even a close family friend. Torturing people like this and living in uncertainty herself is wrong. Her biological mom, as I understand it, needs to be rescued from alcoholism. But unfortunately, you can't help someone who doesn't want to. Forcing healthcare against one's will is a hopeless endeavor. There's flavored tea in the cup. Deborah turned to Michael. Michael, are you on shift tomorrow? Realizing what the orphanage attendant was getting at, the cab driver completed her thought by suggesting Emily. How would you feel about going to your town tomorrow morning without putting it off? Especially since tomorrow will be Saturday. Do you think your parents will be home? The confused girl couldn't believe that right now she had a chance to try to correct the mistake she had made. So she nodded silently. Deborah smiled contentedly. Well, if you have to travel to another city, then you should have time to rest. So Emily, I'll organize a sleeping place for you. Michael, I suggest you stay too. There's a spot on the couch in the break room. Or do you want to go back to your place? Michael, after some thought, decided to stay at the shelter. We'll leave from here tomorrow morning. I don't see the point of driving back and forth across town. So, Deborah, I'll take you up on your kind offer. It seemed to Emily like a miracle she'd given up believing in. The desk clerk put the girl up for the night and went back to Michael. As much as he wanted to talk more with the wise Deborah, she firmly ordered him to rest. Michael, you know I'd love to talk to you, but you have to be on the road tomorrow. If you could just be supportive of the girl. Well, the fact that she trusted a scumbag man, that's every other girl in the orphanage. But the story about the money she took from her foster parents is a little more serious. It's a good thing Emily didn't shy away from it. Although it would have been easier to keep quiet and create an all-white and fluffy image. So she's a good girl. You should watch her. Michael just waved her off. Oh, Deborah, do you all need someone to team up with? I have a history of prison. You know that. And we're almost 12 years apart in age. No, Emily's beautiful, but she's not for me. And after my divorce from my wife, I can't find the strength to trust a woman again. Duty blushed with indignation and began to jokingly reprimand the former ward. How did you generalize the entire female sex? Don't take offense. And in general, go and rest. Tomorrow morning, load into the car and go. Michael had no choice but to obey. In the morning, Emily was incredibly nervous, and only by a miracle managed not to spill hot tea served for breakfast. Poor thing's nervous, Michael thought. But he didn't know how to support his casual companion who had come into his life so abruptly. John realized that he did not feel any romantic feelings for the girl who frankly told about his ridiculous love, but for some reason he really wanted to help her. He called the dispatcher to explain that he wouldn't be coming into work. After a quick tidy-up and a delicious breakfast, he took Emily to her foster parents. The cab driver didn't bother the girl with conversation and only asked if she would mind a softly turned-on radio. The hour-and-a-half ride passed in silence, which reflected Emily's tension. John could see that she was questioning the appropriateness of her intended visit. Emily, if it's appropriate, I could go with you, he suggested. As a sort of moral support. I promise I'll be there for you. There was a glint of hope in the girl's eyes. Of course, I'm an adult, and I have to take responsibility for my own misbehavior. But I'd appreciate it if you'd come with me. It's not that I need your help to defend myself against the just anger of Mom and Dad. It's just that I'm afraid, as Amelia warned me, that one of them will get hurt. In that case, your help could be invaluable. A quick trip to the hospital if necessary. John saw Emily's hand shake as she pressed the intercom button. She probably would have run away if he hadn't been there when she heard a woman's voice on the speaker. Who? The girl answered as if all her strength had left her. Mom, it's me, Emily. Emily, my girl. The voice in the speaker was ringing with joy. Come in quickly. The door opened, and John followed Emily, who did not wait for the elevator, and jumping over the steps, strove to get to the people whom, it seems, did not cease to love. On the platform of the 4th floor, the girl literally ran into the arms of a crying woman, and a man carefully supporting her by the waist. For a few seconds, only separate words were heard: Emily, Mommy, Daddy, in various variations. John felt awkward, but then a man who appeared to be Emily's adoptive father caught his eye. Coming to his senses, he called everyone into the apartment. "Ladies and you, young man, let's go to the apartment." Embarrassed and touched by the family scene, the cab driver had no chance to refuse, for he had promised Emily to stick around. The whole company moved into a cozy, spacious apartment. The woman, as if her life depended on it, hugged Emily again, and the head of the family extended his hand, introducing himself. "My name is Thomas, and this woman is Amber, my wife. And what's your name?" John the cabbie replied. Thomas led his guest into a spacious room with bookcases along the walls and seated him in a comfortable chair, explaining, "It's a pleasure to meet you. You appear to be my daughter's companion, and I'm very grateful to you for bringing her home. We've been waiting over 6 months for her return. Amber wanted to go after her. We knew where she was going, but I told her not to. Emily had always been independent, and she needed to get to the point of wanting to come home on her own. Let your wife and daughter have a little time alone together. In the meantime, tell me honestly, do you have serious intentions toward Emily?" John didn't lie and confessed. "I, except for the desire to help your daughter, had no other intentions. I met her yesterday by chance and I felt sorry for her. She was obviously in a bad situation and didn't know how to get out of it. I had the time and the opportunity, so I decided to do what I could. And it wasn't much, believe me." While Thomas and John had been having a lively conversation, Amber and Emily had apparently calmed down, and the lady of the house invited the men to the table. "Come on, let's go celebrate. We made an order in advance in the nearest cafe, and everything is already prepared." John tried to refuse, but he was persuaded to stay at the table. Emily touched Amber's and Thomas's hands repeatedly, and then began to apologize. "Mom, Dad, I'm so sorry if you can. I'm such a silly girl." The girl, whose tears had just recently dried up, cried again. Amber stood up and hugged her daughter, comforting her. "Come on, sweetie. Daddy and I aren't mad. The only thing is, we were so worried, not knowing where you were or what happened to you. We've been waiting for a phone call from you. If you just keep your mouth shut, it would have been easier for us. Or, if you couldn't overcome yourself, at least call someone you know and let them know how you are and what's going on." John was surprised beyond belief. After all, judging by yesterday's story, Emily regularly called her foster mom's friend, and he silently voiced his bewilderment aloud. "Emily and Amelia were in regular contact. Your friend told her not to bother you, said it wasn't the right time to talk, claimed you were here, almost cursing her." Amber was painful to watch. She was truly shocked at this unexpected turn of events. "Actually, Amelia's been out of the country for 5 months. And since then, we've only talked to her by email. She keeps calling me to visit, to get away, to relax." Emily looked just as shocked as her foster mom. "I don't understand. Amelia, at the last conversation a month ago, told me that visited you just the day before, and that you are still not ready to accept me with apologies." The girl shifted her gaze from Amber to Thomas, who soon asked her daughter in a strange tone, "Emily, call Amelia. Find out how she thinks our apartment is doing." Emily put the phone on speaker, and soon a woman's voice, full of concern and tenderness, came into the room. "Emily, it's so good to hear from you, my dear. Unfortunately, I can't give you any good news. Thomas is still not well. He's back in the hospital, and the doctors even hint that his days are numbered. Amber doesn't want to hear from you. When I mention you to her, she cuts the conversation off and moves on to another topic. So girl, you're just going to have to be patient a little longer." Thomas put his finger to his lips, urging his wife to be silent. And Emily, surprisingly coolly, clarified. "Amelia, pardon me for clarifying, but when was the last time you were at mine? Is this current news?" The voice from the phone answered after a long, sympathetic sigh. "Just visited yesterday. So the news is up to date. There's no point in coming back for now. Only Amber will probably go to a hospital bed, too. But don't despair. Call me if you need anything." Emily said goodbye to her foster mom's friend and turned to her dad. "How come? Amelia so confidently reported that you were in the hospital and was so worried about Mom, who might have gotten hurt too because of my appearance. Amber added. And about just being at our house yesterday, she said that too. I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out that Amelia wasn't trying to help and support us at all, but was pursuing her own interests, and we don't know where she really is. Maybe she's not abroad at all. Thomas, as if remembering something, asked John. Excuse me, but could you give me a ride to a place and back? I can't ask a question that needs to be solved over the phone. The cab driver, who himself was wondering what kind of game Amelia was up to with Emily's family, agreed without hesitation. When they arrived at the address Thomas had given them, John gave his passenger an attentive look. Emily's adoptive father could have been, in his opinion, a lawyer or a mid-ranking official. And the cabbie was leaning toward the second version after all. Not 15 minutes later, Thomas returned to the cab. The man looked dejected and shared his worries with John on the way home. Anyway, it looks like it was Amelia who was involved in Emily losing her head over that sneaky Michael. I just found out that it was none other than my daughter Emily's boyfriend who was in the seat next to her on the plane. That's a little too unlikely for a coincidence, don't you think? And this Michael won Emily's favor too easily, playing on common interests and tastes. She didn't like him, as I recall. And Michael and I had no idea that our girl had been charmed at the instigation of that sneaky Amelia. How cleverly she kept Emily at a distance from us. How masterfully she played on her feelings of guilt. I don't know how I'm going to tell Michael and my daughter. John, caught up in the tangled story, had to stay with Deborah's family. Thomas, softening the news, explained to his wife Amber and adopted daughter that Amelia's actions are like a premeditated action. All the coincidences were too coincidental to keep us apart. I just don't understand why she did it, he said to his wife. Do you have any thoughts about the motives of your so-called friend? Except for self-interest, of course. It could have been easier to get money out of us, but she so froze to hurt us. The woman was confused. I don't understand. We didn't seem to have any big fights. I've always helped in any way I could. Unless. Amber stopped talking and Thomas rushed her. Well, is there something you've stalled on, a thought you've had? Well, when you and I started dating, she tried to beg me to give you up to her. But after I said no, she seemed to calm down. But a 25-year-old grudge can't be the cause of this nightmare we've been living for months. Taking advantage of the silence in the room, John hurried to say goodbye, connecting with his family. Well, I wish you all happiness. Goodbye. Thomas once again thanked the cabbie for his concern. Amber handed over a bag of tissues from the cafe. These aren't even open servings. Take them. Don't say no. At least it'll save you a few times the trouble of cooking. John was returning to New York, which had become his temporary home, and he was glad that he had not passed by someone else's misfortune. May harmony be restored to their family in spite of all their trials, he thought. He wanted desperately to go to his mother's home in Chicago, but instead he overcame a momentary weakness. The man contacted the dispatch, and he even managed to take a few orders, just to delay the moment of returning to the apartment, where no one was waiting for him. As in a whirl of orders, John did not think about Emily and her family. But one evening he got a call from Deborah. John, hello, I'm calling to warn you. There's a situation. A very distinguished-looking man arrived at the orphanage an hour ago. He said he was Thomas, the father of that girl Emily. Remember, he brought some stuff as a thank you. I don't know what for. And then he asked for your phone number. I left it in my office under false pretenses, so I thought I'd call and ask you. Did you have any problems with this passenger? Can I give this unexpected guest your phone number? The cab driver was surprised, but answered. It's fine, my dear Deborah. Thank you for your concern. By the way, it was talking to you that helped Emily decide to go to her parents. So consider all these gifts as payment for your psychological help. Feel free to give me my number. Thomas seemed like a great man. And the fact that he brought things to the shelter says a lot about him. Shortly after John finished talking to Deborah, he got another call. It was Thomas, offering to meet at any convenient place and time. The cab driver, who was just going through a lull in bookings, didn't refuse, and soon the men were comfortably seated at a cafe table. The loud music playing in the hall did not interfere with the conversation. Thomas took the initiative, suggesting, John, how would you feel about changing jobs? You can't always be driving. It's a dangerous profession from every angle and not very healthy. I suggest you join my firm. There's a good vacancy in the commercial department for a good man. And I see you in that position." The cab driver was dumbfounded, but decided to come clean. "Thomas, I realize I can't drive a cab for the rest of my life. But you'll take back your offer when you hear about my criminal record. An economic conviction. Of course you won't believe this, but I wasn't really in jail for anything. Actually, it was for being too trusting. So thank you for your kindness for the offer. But we won't be able to cooperate." But Thomas is suddenly interested. "I'm very curious. I have a lot of good lawyers who can get justice. So it's quite possible to achieve full rehabilitation and even compensation," John admitted. "To be honest, I don't believe in justice at all anymore. I have a mother, so much money invested in trying to justify me, that it is terrible to remember. Only a good apartment had to be exchanged, and it was no use. I'm afraid it won't work now." Except for dashed hopes. Except that John did not take into account the character of the military father, who is accustomed to fight for the truth. The man made a suggestion. "How about this, you give me all the data on your case? I insist on that. At the same time, you take a vacation in your cab service and take an internship, paid, by the way, at my firm. If you like it, you'll get a job. If you don't like it, we'll part on friendly terms. I don't think you're risking anything, and neither am I. But it's a chance to make a difference. How's that?" John couldn't resist such possibilities and answered, "It's a deal, Thomas. Thank you very much." "You're welcome for now," the man smiled. "I'm with my wife before you. And Deborah owes me a debt of gratitude for bringing her daughter home. So this is only a small part of the thanks." John took Thomas's advice, and after a brief conversation with the cab driver and the landlord, he packed his bags and moved to the city, where a new job awaited him. Amber helped him find a place to live. And John felt as if he had wings at his back from the fact that people he didn't know suddenly took such an active part in his fate. After a preliminary call, John met with a lawyer. To the surprise of the former cab driver, his case was taken up by a charming blonde in a colored artificial coat, which did not give the impression of an intricate connoisseur of the law. But it turned out to be a delusion. "Don't worry," she explained to John's puzzled look. "My appearance is just an extra effect to deflect the eyes of my opponents. I'm just coming back from a meeting, and without too much modesty, I'm bragging that justice has won." Then the woman instantly adopted a businesslike tone and suggested to her new client, "John, let's see what's in your file. And then you calmly and honestly, without hiding any unpleasant moments, tell me everything. Let's see what ideas come up." John did not really believe that after years it would be realistic to restore justice. But the lawyer turned out to be a real fury in fighting for his case. She was so meticulously analyzed all the circumstances that it became almost obvious to the man his name, although late, but still will be cleared of shame. Even if everything was not very fast, but the result was worth the wait. John was incredibly proud to tell his mother that now they do not have to be ashamed of the sad fact in his biography. "Mom, you can imagine the lawyer got justice. Not only that, but I'm also entitled to monetary compensation, so you could look for a more comfortable apartment." The elderly woman was incredibly happy for her son, to whom it seemed that luck finally turned to face. She confessed, "Oh, Sonny, and I was stupid, and did not believe that so everything will work out. I thought again, upstart money, even if not from us this time, but from your boss, Thomas. Hey, John, thank God everything worked out. It's just a shame you didn't meet these wonderful people sooner. Then maybe your father would be alive and well now. Hey, but what's to think about now?" John's mom was silent for a moment, then asked, "Son, maybe you'll go back to your homeland now. I missed you very much. Now no one will dare to blame and reproach you." The former cab driver also had thoughts of returning to his hometown, like angry autumn flies. But he didn't want to let down Thomas, who had entrusted him with a position in his firm. John tried not to give his boss any reason to be unhappy with him, and was frankly afraid of his reaction to the news of his decision to move. Occasionally meeting Emily, Thomas's daughter, John rejoiced at the transformation of the girl who had returned to the people who loved her. One day Emily said hello. "Excuse me, I need your help again, or rather my biological mom. I think about her every day. Let her be who she is. But I'm embarrassed that I'm doing so well, as they say, all chocolate, and she's probably barely making ends meet just to buy booze. I don't want to go back to her. I've tried it before. It just hurt everyone. I'm afraid to contact my foster parents to avoid hurting them, so I decided to contact you. Do you think it is possible to put my biological mother in some rehabilitation center? I'm working right now, and I'm willing to pay for services to bring her back to a normal human state. John had an epiphany. I know someone who can answer that question quickly. I think Deborah would be happy to hear from you and help in any way she can. And if you want my opinion, you don't have to hide your intentions from Amber and Thomas. I think they'll appreciate your generosity. You're acting like a real man, which is something to be proud of. The girl thanked the former cab driver who had changed her fate so dramatically and contacted Deborah. Soon the changes affected Emily's biological mother, because Deborah, who was used to doing everything well, took over. There was every chance that the woman would successfully rid herself of her bad habits. Emily shared updates with John about how her birth mom was doing. And despite all attempts not to fall in love, the man fell under the charm of a cute girl. They had already switched to you and occasionally went to the diner, laughing at the conventions. John was uncomfortable that he was attracted to the daughter of the boss who had done so much for him. Deciding that he should move out of harm's way, John headed over to Thomas. Of course, the subordinate did not confess to the boss that the main motive for leaving the career that had just begun to develop was a crush on Emily, and told only about the fact that mom needs care. Thomas did not become indignant, and even promised to give John the best characterization if necessary. Before leaving, no matter how hard John tried to avoid it, he still met with Emily. She caught up with him at the end of the hallway and held him by the sleeve of his jacket, forcing him to turn to her and linger longer than was necessary for a simple greeting. "John, is it just me, or are you hiding from me?" The man had no choice but to lie. "Hello, Emily. Is it your imagination? It's just that I'm getting ready to move and have to do everything almost on the run. So I apologize if somewhere maybe I ran by without stopping." Emily's sly squint made it clear that the girl didn't believe him one bit, which was why she asked another provocative question. "Why, and now, when I caught you by the sleeve? You didn't turn around on purpose when you noticed me." John tried to turn the conversation to a neutral topic. "Emily, how is your birth mom doing? What does Deborah say? Can she be picked up from the rehab center soon?" The emotion on Emily's face disappeared. She admitted that freeing a relative from her vices is not easy, and added, "You're probably avoiding me also because you fear bad heredity." John was so indignant that he involuntarily burst out. "How stupid you are. You've had an angelic appearance and a brilliant upbringing. You're beautiful and smart. Why are you so insecure?" Emily blushed. She had certainly caught John's sympathy, but he had never paid her even disguised compliments before, hardly resembling simple friendship. The girl was scared to trust a man again, but she felt drawn to John, so she held his sleeve and offered, "My mom, Amber, has an anniversary this coming weekend. If you're interested in how my wandering story ends, be sure to come by." Emily quickly, before John realized it, begged him to come, promising him she would. "The birthday girl would be very happy to have you come. Mom considers you a family friend after you brought me home. I'll tell you, there's a huge surprise in store for everyone there." Later, John received a formal invitation from Thomas and headed to the celebration at the appointed time, not even realizing how memorable it would turn out to be. Before the party began, with only Amber, Thomas, Emily, and himself in the banquet room, the doors swung open. A slender, tanned woman with a stunning gait strode toward the birthday girl standing at the empty counter of a hired footman. Emily, seeing the guest, purposely went behind John's broad back and pulled out her cell phone. The woman, walking up to Amber, began her congratulatory speech. "Amber, heartfelt congratulations to you." Suddenly there was the trill of a cell phone. The woman glanced at the screen, dropped the call, and continued her speech with a smile, but she was interrupted again by the ringing. Amber prompted, "Amelia, I'm glad you took the time. To finish talking, take the call." The friend who had arrived from abroad waved her hands and had already switched off her smartphone when Emily called out to her. "Why do not answer me and Amelia just news? I want to know if I can go home or am I still cursed on winter evenings?" Even the tan didn't hide the blush on her guest's cheeks, but she tried to feign joy. "Emily, and you're here. How glad I am that Amber and Thomas have found the strength to forgive you and you're back together. That's a big deal. Let's celebrate." Amelia slapped herself on the forehead and laughed. "I forgot my present in the car. Wait a second, 1 foot here, 1 foot there. I'll get it." Amelia couldn't get past Thomas and John at the door, however. Giggling, she hurried to the emergency exit. But her escape-like maneuver was interrupted by the birthday girl. "Amelia, please explain why you hate me so much that you decided to separate me even from my daughter. I have only once failed to yield to you, and you've invented a trial you wouldn't wish on an enemy. Just answer me why." Panic flashed across the guest's face, but she admitted it was out of jealousy. "You've always been the best, and I'm always in the background. You think it's easy to fall short? I've been looking for your weakness for a long time. Your husband turned out to be your husband, so I went after your daughter with the help of Michael the catcher. Then it was a matter of technique. You can't prove my guilt, and you can kiss your money goodbye." But Amelia was wrong. Thanks to Thomas's connections, Michael was extradited, and together with Amelia he was put under investigation. A little later, they were sentenced. Emily and John's relationship grew more tender by the day. Of course, it didn't go unnoticed for long, as both Amber and Thomas were now closely watching every change in their child's mood. The girl believed in love again, and it was impossible not to notice it. John already had his labor book in hand when his boss invited him into the office where his wife and daughter were already there. Smiling, Thomas said, "Now that's a role I never thought I'd ever find myself in, but John seems to be too decent. My wife and I have long noticed that you have a soft spot for Emily and are trying to keep your feelings in check. Well, we don't mind you two dating. We even agree that the two of you should go to your homeland to think about and decide where you'd like to live. Amber and I agree to whatever you decide in advance." John and Emily couldn't believe their happiness. After a visit to the man's mom in her hometown, they decided to take her in and settle closer to the girl's adoptive parents. This decision satisfied everyone without exception. The bell rang at the most businesslike time, 10 a.m. At this hour, she still liked the movie Arrhythmia, the one about the emergency room doctor. But before that, she couldn't understand the main character's girlfriend. The girl returns when the house is buzzing with drunken company. She is invited to join them. She deflects with words say, "Not now, guys, I'm tired." She goes into the next room, closes the door behind her, turns on the music and falls asleep. How can she fall asleep in such a mess, and to a song? When Miranda became an EMT, she understood. Now she could pass out on the bus, or in a concert hall, or at home, even if the ceiling above her was on fire, especially after a night like tonight. Of course, it's not an ambulance, but it's not much easier. There are times when the duty is more or less calm, but now the labor was a mess. In addition, the older one, with twins, also decided to give birth now. 2 weeks ahead of schedule, by the way. It's a good thing everything went without complications. We didn't have to call for help from surgery. But Miranda went home, as they say, down the wall. When she returned, her husband had already gone to work, leaving behind unwashed dishes and a hungry cat. Miranda caught herself using medical terms in her normal life, too. The gray puddle's pitiful and demanding cries had been controlled with the help of a couple of Purina packets. Then Miranda sat on the stool, unable to decide whether she wanted to eat or sleep. The last thing she wanted to do was move and get up. Finally, she cut off a thicker piece of sausage, drank the sandwich with milk straight from the bottle, and wandered to the bedroom, taking off her clothes as she went. What indescribable bliss it was to collapse into a clean, soft bed, to burrow into the pillows. Sometimes it seemed to Miranda that somewhere down there, deep down, if you climbed into it, there was a childhood left. You could dive into your own bed and come out in one where you were 10 years old and had so much strength that you could fly. But she wasn't flying now. The crow horse kicked her in the stomach with its hoof, but it didn't hurt, only frightened her. Probably if she had been dreaming a good and peaceful dream, the phone call would not have woken her up. But the black horse, multiplied by the mechanical trills coming from the corridor. 100 times Miranda wanted to give up the landline. She wished she and William only had cell phones that could be set to do not disturb. But the apartment belonged to her mother-in-law, and Peggy Urton's principle of life was let it be this applied to everything, from old buttons which her mother-in-law carefully kept in a wooden box, and to the non-working television set, which had been moved to the pantry. What if it was still useful? The phone went silent, then rang again. Miranda got up as slowly as if she hadn't woken up on the move, but had been revived and was still part zombie. In the hallway, she leaned against a coat rack. Candy Adamson? A voice asked, sounding like it belonged to a very young girl. If the girl pretended to be a special investigator, she could hang up right away. But no, Miranda felt a vengeful feeling. She even wanted the girl to say, "Scammers are trying to make a loan in your name, and you have to help us. Then you can remember the turbulent years of youth and tax the wench not even 7 stories, but that the size of a skyscraper." The resentment at fate for waking her up was so great that Miranda longed to let the wench's ear melt from her profanity. "It's the assistant notary," the girl said. "You need to come to our place on the Embarcadero to read the will. You have an inheritance. Will you accept it or refuse it? Can you come today? We're open till 6. No, Miranda didn't know why she'd said that. Let's do it tomorrow. Later, she couldn't explain to herself why she had decided to take this pause. "And who? Who left me an inheritance?" she asked. "Can you tell me the name? And what inheritance are we talking about?" "It's a house. You've been bequeathed a house. Come and have it explained to you." Then the girl got distracted. Someone started to question her. She started to answer the person she was talking to, and a couple of moments later she hung up. Miranda was left at a complete loss. She went back to the bedroom and climbed into bed again. But sleep didn't come to her now. A house. She would have been surprised if someone had left her even a small amount of money. There was no such person. And suddenly a whole house. It would be possible if she had been a social worker, taking care of some lonely old woman. But who gives such gifts to midwives? Miranda tried to think, but something like a premonition stopped her. "Don't, it was an inner voice, otherwise you might remember something very, very unpleasant." It was too late. Miranda put her palm to her mouth. She saw that face right in front of her again, those eyes, a rich emerald color like no living person's ever had. Not unless contact lenses. Again that caressing, ingratiating voice whispered, "And I'll make you a present. You'll get it when the time comes. Then you won't turn away, you won't go away." Has the hour come? Perhaps her family was once an ordinary young family with a husband and wife who love each other and their little daughter. They are almost children themselves, and they sincerely consider her to be the 8th wonder of the world. Only Miranda didn't remember those wonderful times, even if she was dipping her memory deep, deep into the place where all outlines are blurred and reality is so easy and simple to coexist with a fairy tale. For example, she once caught a star. The 5-beam neon blue star was lying in the palm of her hand and glowing. "It's bad for star on Earth," said Mom. "Let's let her go to the sky." And as soon as Miranda unclenched her fingers, the star, easily like an air bubble or a balloon, began to rise. Miranda still believed it had really happened. Her mother only laughed when she mentioned it. Another time Miranda was flying. She and Daddy were walking through town. There was a blizzard, very strong winds, and real snow swirls. And she was about 3 years old. Daddy held her hand, but the wind picked her up and carried her. It was a tiny distance, just 2 or 3 steps, but a real flight. These are the only 2 memories of a happy family. But it's so easy to say, even to yourself, if you're sober nonsense, it never happened, it couldn't have happened. And what was real, on the one hand, my father somewhere far away in a distant northern city. On the other, Mom and stepdad. My father never came, only called 3 or 4 times a year. And he sent gifts. A reindeer hat, pine nuts for Miranda, and money for what her daughter needed by postal order in her mother's name. And Mom and stepdad had careers. Later, when Miranda watched Western movies with an adult eye, she thought they would fit in perfectly in this life where careers ruled the roost. No, stepfather never hurt his stepdaughter, and Mom was quite attentive whether she needed to take Miranda to the children's clinic or celebrate her birthday. Mom never forgot not only the important, but even the little things, and did everything flawlessly. My mom worked as a lawyer, and her memory was phenomenal. She memorized all her clients, even their phone numbers, by heart, and if you woke her up at night, she could recite the pages of a case like poetry. If she undertook to defend someone, almost with 100% probability this person could celebrate victory in advance. The stepfather was in the construction business. Miranda took it literally. Her stepfather was tied up in the construction business, but he was in love with his bonds. Business trips, clients, new projects, he could only talk about these things at home. And my mother about court hearings, about the defense arguments, about sarcastic prosecutors and their triumphs, more like a victory in a fight. And so often one would say to the other stepmother's stepfather or vice versa, "I'm proud of you." This pride was evident. During the time my mother lived in her second marriage, they changed several apartments, each time moving to a more spacious one and closer to the historical center. The brands of cars changed. The resorts to which my mother and stepfather went on vacation became more and more prestigious and expensive. And on the other side was Miranda and her life. For a while, a long time ago, Mom had wanted them to be friends. And then it just sort of went straight to another dimension. It's good that you're growing up on your own. Soon you'll be living on your own, and then. Miranda used to go camping. She was 12 years old when she joined the Young Hikers Club. The leader of the hikers was the same, the restless Margot, with a stick up her ass, as her stepfather used to say. And so it began. Every weekend, a hike in the surrounding mountains. Even in winter. They returned in the early twilight, drunk with frost, hungry, because there was never enough tea in the thermos and pies, and did not hurry to scatter home, but sat in the club exchanging impressions, telling stories, making plans. And Miranda came home the way her stepfather probably came home to the hotel on business trips just to spend the night. And during the vacations. Then we'd take a train to some glorious city, and Margot would swear because the guys would play The City Goes to Sleep and The Mob Wakes Up all night long, and the girls would lock themselves in the bathroom and spend half an hour there to put on makeup with sense, with purpose, with care, and really you can't walk around San Francisco without makeup. It's like going barefoot in the street. Or we rafted down the river in kayaks, went on the Zhigulevskaya around the world trip, or on a horseback ride. If Miranda had been asked about her plans in those years, she would have said she would never settle down, never put down roots somewhere in one place like those closest to her did. She wants a house on the water, some sort of very simple yacht. And after the small journeys, the big journeys are sure to follow. When now you can go to Ireland, to the Emerald Isle. You can live in a haunted castle, dance in the street on St. Patrick's Day, and then pull up the anchors and sail to the opposite end of the earth somewhere in New Zealand, to another Emerald Island, so that the whole world can be hugged like that pillow before going to sleep, and enjoy its beauty when reality is more beautiful than any dream. Soon, very soon, she will be on her own feet, and then goodbye to the cold house and the ambitious dreams of its inhabitants. She has enough of herself and a backpack on her back. Her family are sober people and know that their desires have limits. And what Miranda wanted was always over the top. And she did not try to seize what she admired, to appropriate it for herself. It was enough for her that she saw it, that it existed under the sun. All these amazing cities, castles, waterfalls, depths. And then everything changed and ended. In one day, or rather one evening. The very night the circus came to town. No, she wasn't going to go to the show. Miranda avoided taking money from her mother unless she could do without it. When she started earning her own money, that would be different. It was just a spring evening on her way back from the club. She was on her way through the park, and there was a colorful tent, and the wagons were close together, one to another. Everyone around was enjoying the warmth, almost the first of the year. Already they wanted to throw off their coats and jackets. Already they could see the coming summer ahead. There was a queue at the iron fence at the entrance, where they were checking tickets. Miranda had never seen so many children all winter, both very young, in strollers and a little older, and almost all of them were holding white and cotton candy clouds. Miranda was drawn to the carriages. They were so different in this celebration of life, tired, with peeling paint, with wheels that had measured thousands of kilometers. They smelled of sweat, old age, and cheap powder. Miranda stroked one of them with the palm of her hand, a motion of compassion. "Come here," she suddenly heard a voice say. It wasn't someone real calling out to her, a voice sounded in her head. Please, it didn't say, but Miranda realized that this someone was asking for her. She almost whispered back, but how, and immediately realized what she had to do. Just get on all fours, or even crawl, and crawl into that circle. But in the carriages, live circus performers and their animals. And of course she'd be chased out of here right away. At best they'll call her a fool, because there are predators here. At worst, they'll think she was trying to steal something. but she couldn't refuse the voice. And so, moving like a caterpillar, pushing with her legs and knees, she crawled the few meters. Now the voice sounded as if the unknown man were speaking directly into her ear. "Let me out." She jerked, tried to look around, and immediately banged her head painfully against the metal bottom of the wagon. No one was near her, but someone was calling out to her. At the same time, Miranda saw that there was no one on the small platform that the cars surrounded on all sides. Then she decided to climb out. That cage was right above her. Above where she had just crawled. There was no other way to call it a cage because it was a frequent grating, and inside it sat a man. A boy about the same age as her. He was looking at her, but his lips did not move, and she heard it clearly again. "Let me out. Open the latch. No one should be in a cage, no living thing. My mother told me that once, when Miranda was a little girl and they took her to the sea. Every time she passed a fisherman, she tried to save a single fish. Stealthily snatch it from the bucket and release it into the sea. But now she wasn't at all sure she could handle the lock. Just pull the latch to the side. It sticks sometimes. Pull it hard, one pull." That impatient voice ... Did it actually sound, or did she hear it in her head? Miranda pulled the latch with both hands, writhing with effort. Then she stood on her tiptoes and pushed against it with her skinny body. And that's when the latch finally slid sideways, smooth as butter. The boy was already standing near the door, and when he heard the click, he opened it with lightning speed. And faster than Miranda realized what was happening, he slid under the wagon and was gone. "Who are you? What's your name?" "I'll find you, Miranda," she said. And before she could answer, the last words came out. She needed to get out of here as fast as the former prisoner had disappeared. But at the same moment, she saw an older man. More like an old man, a tall, thin man in a blue shirt and jeans. He was carrying 2 buckets, probably on his way to feed the animals. When he saw the open cage, he did not set it down, but dropped his burden and raised his palms. "I only got here now ... I'm late ... Didn't manage to stop you ... Girl. What did you do? What's that boy in there for?" "He's being punished, isn't he?" Miranda asked, trying to establish some kind of rapport with the old man. But the man only shook his head. "Maybe it's a good thing you did it, but what happens now? Get out of here if you can." Miranda didn't have time to take his advice. A woman entered the small area, surrounded by carriages and hidden from view. She was about 35 years old, and there was so much inner strength in her that even her step was dancing. Her dark hair hung to her shoulders, and she was very pretty, but that wasn't what impressed Miranda. The woman was eating a rose. Yes, she was holding a red rose on a long stem and devouring it voluptuously, like ice cream. The old man seemed to hold his breath the moment the woman saw the open door and the empty cage. She raised her thin eyebrows in surprise and turned around to the old man. It said without words that she was waiting for an explanation. The old man waved his hands. "I only came now. I saw for myself what you saw. It was too late to run." And Miranda braced herself for the reprimand she was about to receive. The boy probably deserved a severe punishment, and she'd set him free. The woman handed the old man the tattered flower and walked toward Miranda. The closer she came, the more uncomfortable she felt. When the stranger leaned over her so that Miranda could feel her breath on her, she was seized with an irrational terror. The woman held her by the shoulder, and her fingers were strong, as if made of metal. "You stole from us, sweetheart." It took Miranda gathering all her courage to answer. "But if that boy lives with you, he'll come back. He'll go for a walk and then he'll come back." "He's not coming back." A smile appeared on the woman's lips, and Miranda felt as if she were about to share the rose's fate. The stranger bent down, and there's no way out. Bright green eyes, that glowing hue that no living person could ever have, stared straight at her. "For what you have done, you will get a present." The woman's voice became ingratiating, cooing, like a predator enjoying her prey. "Oh, not now. But the hour will come, and you will surely get it. You won't be able to refuse my gift, and then nothing will save you. Get out." Her fingers loosened on Miranda's shoulder, but the pain remained. The girl felt that her right arm was barely obeying her, just a whip. The old man hurriedly, nudging her in the back, led her out of the courtyard and onto the wicket, behind which the people with tickets were crowding. Stepping back a few steps, Miranda turned around. The old man was still looking at her, shaking his head. The expression on his face was as if he were saying goodbye to someone who was hopelessly ill. "Maybe I shouldn't go." Miranda asked her husband for the umpteenth time. "It's probably a divorce ... who would bequeath the house to me. Neither my dad nor my mom would do that. And besides, we're talking about a will, and they're still alive. Thank God ... She hoped William would listen to her. He liked to amuse himself by talking to crooks. When he received another warning that someone had gained access to his bank deposit, he would make himself comfortable on the sofa and say, feigning alarm, that he had millions in his account, and of course he was very worried about them. Therefore, of course, he was ready to fulfill all the orders of the investigator. Then followed a half-hour conversation, during which William pretended to be an idiot who had to explain everything 20 times. And only when he had driven the crooks to a frenzy did he laugh obscenely loud, send them to the mother lode, and call it a day. But now her husband was unaccustomedly serious. "Let's go there and find out," he suggested. "There really is a notary at that address, and has been for years," he said. "If it's a stupid joke, they'll explain it to us. We're not risking anything." What if? Well, what the hell? I had to agree to it heartily. And it was so fortunate that on the day Miranda had bargained for, they were both free. The young woman had even mapped out an escape route for herself. If the inheritance turns out to be a hoax, they will go to a small bistro nearby as a sign of moral compensation. The ice cream cocktails, they were very good. And it's been so long since they've been out together with William. In fact, Miranda was prepared to have the notary's office point them out the door as soon as she said her last name. "That's the first we've heard. There's no inheritance for you. And no one called you." But they were politely invited to wait in the reception area. They had to wait in line for an hour. Miranda was getting more and more nervous, occasionally taking her husband's hand and squeezing it tightly. Then she let go and looked at William with a guilty smile. He nodded reassuringly, saying, "Wait, it'll all work out." Finally, their turn came, and now the notary, a blooming woman in her 50s, pulls out papers from a file and reads out in her usual rapid-fire voice that the will makes Candy Adamson the owner of the house located at. William's face reflected complete amazement. It was a dream to live in a place like this. An ancient boulevard that stretched through the center of the city and ended at the foot of the mountains. They had never hoped to live in one of these mansions. It was simply impossible. Probably we're talking about some backwoods chicken shed after all. Miranda, on the other hand, had other things to worry about. How she interjected. "Could you please tell me the name of the woman who left me all this?" "Tiffany Gilbert," the notary read in syllables. "I knew her. She came to me many times. Her grandson was a troublemaker, a drunk. But the grandmother herself was wonderful. Almost to the last day she was running around the stores by herself, with those Nordic poles. She survived the blockade, by the way." Things got very confusing. To the notary, too. The woman pushed her glasses up on her nose and shifted her eyes from Miranda to William and back again. "So you're saying you didn't know her at all?" "What about that son of hers?" William asked. "In order to change the conversation, he won't sue us? After all, he probably hoped to inherit from his mother." "The son, as far as I know, died before she did. It's not uncommon for alcoholics to have parents who get over them. Maybe that's what got Tiffany Gilbert down. And how did the grandmother blockade survivor get such a house? As far as I know, such old ladies have time to save up for their funerals and only." Her husband was a famous man. The notary's voice became drier, as if William's over-suspiciousness was unpleasant to her. "So ... sign here ... now here." It didn't seem to occur to the notary that such an inheritance could be refused. William, too, waited impatiently for Miranda to sign here, and wherever there was a check mark. So the young woman went outside as a homeowner. Miranda and William looked at each other. They both had the same thought to go to see. "Hold on, I'll call my mom," William said, and pulled out his phone. Miranda didn't want to see Peggy Urton again, but she understood her husband. Mom had been with him all her life, and Miranda had only been with him for 3 years. So he wanted to share his joy with someone he'd become diffusely attached to. Miranda mentally groaned her scientific terms again. She couldn't think or speak otherwise. Peggy Urton was apparently so shocked that she took the unprecedented step of calling a cab. Normally, she would have considered this a hobby, and calculated how much of her pension would be eaten up by such a millionaire's game. But when they reached the house, Peggy Urton was already there. They recognized the mansion from a distance because a familiar figure was walking along the sidewalk and wringing her hands in delight. She believed in this miracle that had fallen on their heads. Maybe because she'd been waiting for miracles all her life, dreamed of winning the lottery or find the treasure, waiting for God to say to her, as in the commercials, "You deserve it." "Did you bring the key?" was the first thing Peggy Urton asked, forgetting to say hello. William spread his hands. "We just wanted to see." It was a house of old brick, of some dull purple color. It had arched windows, a mezzanine, a balcony with a wrought iron lattice, and a front lawn, like the neighboring mansions. "How could you not even know about the key?" Peggy Urton reprimanded. "We have to figure out the scope of work." Miranda looked at her in bewilderment and noted that it was probably the first time her mother-in-law had ever treated her as an equal. Miranda had been in disgrace before, and often when they met, her mother-in-law spoke only to her son, and it was as if her daughter-in-law were not even there. There was an official reason, of course. "She takes other people's children, but she can't have her own," her mother-in-law had once said, and Miranda had heard it. But in her heart, Miranda thought she just didn't like her mother-in-law. There are times when a person arouses antipathy, and no matter how much you smash him to pieces. Now Peggy Urton was excitedly explaining to her specifically. "I can already see that the windows here need to be changed. We can measure them today and order plastic ones. I know a company that gives senior citizens a discount." "How can you ruin such an antique?" Miranda wondered. Then a neighbor called out to them. Peggy Urton hurried to her, asking for the key, and it turned out that there was a key, and the neighbor was about to bring it out. Miranda hesitated, delaying until the last minute, the moment when there would be no way out and she would have to enter the house. On the other side, an elderly neighbor was mowing his lawn and occasionally glanced curiously at the new tenants. Miranda took a few steps in his direction. "Did you buy a house or something?" the neighbor asked. "It was an inheritance," Miranda said, her tone apologetic to Miranda's surprise. Not only did the old man not congratulate her, he did not say anything friendly, as one might expect. On the contrary, he nodded his head as if in sympathy. "Are you going to turn it in?" he asked, as if still hoping for something. No, Miranda glanced around. The door was open, so her husband and mother-in-law were already checking out the new property. "I guess we'll be moving here ourselves." The old man lost interest in her and went back to his lawnmower. "Why did you ask?" Miranda asked before she left. He shrugged. "Because it's not going to end well. Nobody lives here for long." "You don't like it?" Miranda asked cautiously. The old man shrugged. "Sorry, I didn't get a chance to ask. Today the tenants are still here, and they don't seem to be going anywhere, and tomorrow they're gone. No one's been here more than a year." "Excuse me, but the landlady?" Miranda suddenly remembered. She's owned this house for years. So she didn't live here. She was a renter. I only ever saw her when she came to meet the new tenants and show them around. What would scare them away? It didn't sound like a direct question, but like Miranda was thinking out loud. The old man was silent for a moment, then pointed a bony finger toward the house. "I've been living here myself for 50 years, so I can't say that others don't like it. But I've worked it out. If the shutters close, you're waiting for new tenants." "What do you mean?" Miranda asked in confusion. "The landlady would come, close the shutters, and then bring the people who wanted to rent the house." Nope. The old tenants were still here. You know, people aren't used to shutters. It doesn't even occur to them to close them at night. Why is it that one evening the shutters are suddenly closed? And nobody opens them in the morning? A day or two goes by and the landlady brings someone new. She unlocks the windows and doors and shows the house in all its glory. If you're going to live here, you might be able to clear up this mystery. Miranda saw her husband walking toward her from the house, and that he was happy as can be, smiling ear to ear. "Don't you want to look at it?" he asked before he could approach. "Go take a look. You'll like it." "I doubt it," Miranda muttered quietly. The men shook hands, and William spoke again. Miranda realized at once that he was stinking with joy. She called it verbal incontinence. His husband talked about everything at once, straying from topic to topic. He asked if the rent was high and what was the land tax. He always mentioned that he was glad to meet the neighbors, and of course shared his plans for what he wanted to build here. A garage and a bathhouse first and foremost. The old man listened aloofly, and eventually the animation in William's voice began to fade. "Come on," her husband took Miranda's hand. "You'll see how nice it is inside. You'll like it." She really liked it. The corridor is very wide and bright, and the windows look out onto the garden. And in winter you can put plants in tubs and look at the greenery all year round. Big rooms. And where there was a hall, as they call the most spacious room, would fit their entire current apartment. Peggy Urton's eyes lit up, and she talked so enthusiastically about the renovations as if the house belonged to her, as if Miranda was nobody. The young woman only noted this, but took no offense. She waited politely for her mother-in-law to shut up and felt sorry for the way things had turned out. William sensed something. "Do you agree with everything Mom suggests?" he asked. "Is there anything you'd like to change?" Peggy Urton stopped precisely at a run-up. She looked at Miranda, as if she were looking at an unfortunate obstacle that might interfere with her plans. But the young woman only shook her head. "I don't really care. Do as you see fit. Vitya, when we take Mom, let's stop at a cafe and order a large cocktail." William liked to remember how they met. He thought it was very beautiful and romantic. Miranda had gone on vacation with her mother and stepfather. Not because she had succumbed to her mother's entreaties. It was just that the camping trip Margot had planned had fallen through. The head of the hiking club ended up in the hospital. She had to have her gallbladder removed as a matter of urgency. "I've been going somewhere all my life, eating what's cooked in a cauldron. Some porridge with stew. How can I be healthy?" Miranda was very upset then. All winter long she had dreamed of these 2 weeks on horseback and in her native mountains. The starry sky at night, the legends Margot was good at telling, the honeyed smell of flowers, the tea that smelled of smoke, and the camaraderie that was the strongest in the world. Her mother noticed Miranda walking around upset, her eyes wet, found out what was wrong, and solved the problem in one fell swoop. "You're coming to Egypt with us," she said, "and don't be naughty, please. It's a great hotel, and you'll find something to do without us if you're bored." The stepfather expressed neither joy nor displeasure, and the matter of the trip was settled. Miranda was going into her senior year of high school that summer. She hadn't vacationed with her mother in a long time, and now that she was looking at her with adult eyes, she wondered if her mother was partying her ass off. Usually reserved, energetic, decisive, a real businesswoman, now she behaved like a child, ready to agree to any adventure. "Jump into the water from the rocks, please. A party on a yacht in the open sea, she is the first. To try some new exotic dish, give only a fork." And even at the disco, her mother danced as if she were 20 years younger than she really was. If that's what she considers real life, if that's what she is, how can she suppress it for a whole year? Miranda thought. So it's back home, Mom's not real, keeping herself in line. How hard that must be. She herself remained as she had always been. She couldn't stand the heat very well, and it was hard to tempt her to go sightseeing or stroll the local streets. But the hotel was nice, and Miranda spent most of her time in its coolness. But she liked the sea very much. Miranda was not a good swimmer, and her greatest pleasure was just sitting in the water, wearing a mask, and looking at everything around her, at the magnificent underwater world. Mom noticed this and organized a scuba diving trip. With an instructor, of course, but the swarthy guy, who swam like a fish, paid more attention to his mother and stepfather than to Miranda. He decided to show them some underwater caves. The girl, however, found herself in the depths, at some point panicked, and she immediately became short of breath. Perhaps the worst thing is to panic. In the blue haze surrounding you from all sides, you can no longer understand where the top is, where the bottom is. You try to surface, you get desperate, because the surface is not approaching. Your movements become cramped, your throat spasms. It was good that William had been there at that moment and had picked up Miranda, who was hysterical, and surfaced with her. He had said many times afterward that he didn't know what would have happened without him. And Miranda could sense that he was proud of himself. Then they did not part for the rest of the vacation. Miranda's mother, who had not even noticed the incident, was pleased that her daughter had found herself a good boy. William introduced Miranda to his parents, but the girl immediately felt that Peggy Urton did not like her. Probably the latter thought that Miranda was too simple for her son. William was a tall, handsome boy, and here she was a tanned, ponytailed brat. But the young people spent almost all their time together, and no one could prevent them. And the memory of the underwater adventure, of saving the girl, remained the most vivid and dear for William. Now Miranda had the feeling that her husband was drowning, and now it was her turn to save the day. Jeremy had been told from childhood that he was a special child, but he hadn't noticed it for a long time. Reading other people's thoughts was as easy for him as noticing that it was raining or sunny outside. He answered questions before his parents had time to ask them, and it was useless to secretly think up a birthday present for him. And when he was a baby, he often embarrassed his mother on walks by telling her in his sonorous baby voice what people were thinking as they walked toward him. ... But he didn't want anything that time. Honestly, he was old enough, 10 years old, to control himself perfectly well. And by the way, he'd never really liked the circus. His classmates had dragged him to see the show. And he could have gotten away with it. He would have left the circus with the rest of them if he hadn't been so stupidly caught in the act. When the magician, who looked very tired and not at all fun at heart, asked someone from the audience to help him, Jeremy, to his misfortune, volunteered. He was blindfolded, forced to turn his back, and the magician went into the auditorium to hide a crystal egg from someone in the audience. Then the magician removed a thick black blindfold from Jeremy's eyes and waved his hand in the direction of the gathered people. They said, "Choose who has it." It was supposed to start a game of cold and hot, but Jeremy did not think for a minute. He said, pointing with his chin at a heavy-set man, and he advised, "You'd better switch at once. He will give you the egg, and you will give him the live rooster. After all, you still wanted to get it and say that the uncle had hatched it out of the egg, like a hen." The audience laughed, and the magician laughed. After the show, the circus performers, though whether they were circus performers, vampires, or evil sorcerers, was more like them, asked Jeremy how he'd done it and what else he could do. He spoke honestly about his abilities, adding that he gets along well with them in ordinary life, and he is not going to perform in the circus. The most beautiful of the women ruffled his hair. "Think about it. If you ride with us, you'll be rich and famous. We can ask your parents to let you go." Jeremy even laughed, imagining how his dad and mom would react to such a suggestion. They'd worry if he was half an hour late at school or at a friend's birthday party. They'd let him go to who knows where, with who knows who. I don't know. Finally, Jeremy was released, and he ran out into the park, drenched in the last rays of the sun, which was about to disappear over the horizon. His friends were waiting for him, and everything seemed to be the same as usual, running home with the boys. A delicious dinner prepared by his mother's stew with potatoes and cakes for tea. But it was as if someone had put an ice flake down his neck, and it wouldn't melt. And the next morning, hurrying to school, he saw the very beauty from the circus. She stood slender, flexible, in black leather pants, standing near the corner of the house, and to all appearances, waiting for him. "Come here a minute," he heard him say. Only then, much later, did he realize that the woman had not uttered a word aloud. Had there been a witness to the scene, he would have said that the stranger had been silent. But her thoughts were so clear and strong that he went to them as to a call. Then he saw a van around the corner, and a moment later a black handkerchief fell across his face. ... Over the years, they've used different ways to keep him. They tied him by a rope, chained him, kept him in a cage. His attempts to escape were especially desperate and hopeless at first, when he knew his parents were searching for him and going mad with anxiety. From here, from afar, he couldn't read their thoughts, but he could feel how they felt, and it brought him to tears, to the point of wanting, like an animal caught in a trap, to chew off a limb and escape. But he did not compete with ordinary people. He realized that at once. His attempts were anticipated with a smile and thwarted. He was punished, but not cruelly. They could have done anything to him, for he was at their mercy. But they never hit him, never physically hurt him. More often than not, they just left him hungry, sometimes for days at a time. The traveling circus continued to travel the world, and it seemed to Jeremy that he was trapped in some ruthless mechanism, and it was impossible to get out of it, only to obey. Sometimes, very rarely, he was forced to take part in the performances, and he invariably surprised the audience to the point of exclaiming, "It can't be. It's a hell of a thing." But the main thing that was expected of him was to find others like himself. Those who could understand him when not a single word was spoken aloud, when only a mental conversation was going on. There were such people, even if only occasionally. Of course, none of them had a gift equal to the one Jeremy had, All of them turned out to be weaker than him. There were those who could see the future, but Jeremy had never met a strong clairvoyant. The people he'd pointed out had been introduced to the circus people, talked to them. And Jeremy subconsciously expected that sooner or later one of them would end up next to him in the cage. But it didn't happen. When he asked Ada, the very beauty who was in charge of them all, she only smiled. "You're the best. You're all we need. Even I can't stand to be around you." "Why do you need all these people?" he wondered. And then she spoke the very words he thought. "It's a fairy tale. It can't be real. Because of these people, we are practically immortal. Our lives don't end." And that girl who helped Jeremy eventually escape, they must have seen her as a tidbit too. Peggy Urton was learning the finer points of repair. God knows where she got her information. If she'd ever cared about the subject before, it was only in terms of envy of her friends. Peggy Urton was a homebody. Almost always something kept her from going out. In winter, ice on the streets, I'll slip and break my femoral neck, and you'll have to take care of me summer heat. I can only exist under air conditioning. Spring and fall had their own resonances. And the main means of communication with the world remained the telephone and a friend. And Peggy Urton's life remained bland and uninteresting compared to that of her friends. There were dacha feats, overcoming themselves, unimaginable harvests and industrial-scale harvesting. Sagas concerning grandchildren and granddaughters, their health, their pranks, words, gifts. And of course, His Majesty repair ideas and their realization, exciting search for materials, handy or handless sons and sons-in-law, and finally the triumphant completion of the process to begin tomorrow to change something, because there is no limit to perfection. Against this background, Peggy Urton had nothing to tell. No country house, only flowers on the balcony, no grandchildren, only a cat at the young, and it was better not to even talk about repairs, because her friends comparing with her own would have found Peggy Urton's place murdered. The only thing the elderly woman was saving for was her own funeral. After the sudden death of her husband from a heart attack, she went into debt, and now she did not want to repeat the same story about herself. But even here she was disappointed. Her son only laughed. "Mom, there's no one left on top of the earth. They're all buried somehow. Or do you want a crystal coffin and telephone service in the other world?" "I want you not to be ashamed," Peggy Urton began. "Would you, to be honest, care anymore?" Her friends, on the other hand, spoke with feigned sighs. "Oh, we're trying to save something too. But my granddaughter is studying in St. Petersburg. I'm helping her pay the rent. My grandson wants to change the car. My daughter needs a kitchen set." It appeared that Peggy Urton had set herself some small, secondary goal, and it was weighing her down. But now it's going to turn around. A luxurious house, a real estate. Fixing it up is not like fixing up a high-rise apartment. Peggy Urton withdrew her funeral stash, sold the shares left by her husband. But her friends, pining with envy, gave her a disturbing thought. Peggy Urton immediately summoned her son and had a long conversation with him. That same evening, William told Miranda with a nervous chuckle, "Mom wants you to sign over part of the house to her. She has invested a lot of money in renovations. So here she collected all the receipts and handed them to me for you to look at." They had never had a fight over anything material before money. Things ... William was ready to back down. But what he hadn't expected was for his wife to shine. "Do you think your mom would mind if I signed the whole house over to her? Would she accept a gift like that?" "Are you serious?" "This is as serious as it gets. I'm willing to sign a deed of gift with the same notary." Needless to say, Peggy Urton had a sleepless night when she learned of this. Plans swarmed in her head, and each one was better than the last. Then she saw a garden, a beautiful garden, in an equally beautiful old neighborhood of the city, not in the outskirts of the city, where her friends' cottages were. Then she dreamed of eventually getting rid of the modern cheap stuff and furnishing the old house exclusively with antiques. Then she imagined a housewarming party, and her friends, out of curiosity, of course, would come running and be amazed. That's when it would be their turn to bite their elbows. In the morning, Peggy Urton called her daughter-in-law, not her son, but for the first time. She spoke to her with unusual warmth. Miranda was to come, by all means, and see how she was organizing the house. "It will be your inheritance after my death anyway," said the mother-in-law. Miranda shrugged as if the room was suddenly cold. She had put off this moment until the last minute, but now she had to go. Her mother-in-law showed her the house with the air of a tour guide who had her own personal museum. And this is where the living room will be. Look at it, it's so pretty. It might be a little dark in the summer because the windows overlook the garden. The lilac bushes will grow ... I want to hang a big crystal chandelier here. I don't care if they say it's last century. The house needs the last century. And I want a fireplace. Then we can make a real one, by the way. I know how to make a stove. I learned it from my grandmother when I was a kid. In the meantime, we'll put in an electric fireplace, but to have a very good imitation of a live fire. Miranda had been following Peggy Urton from room to room for the past half hour, and the polite smile on her face made her cheekbones ache. Her mother-in-law regretted that the dining room wasn't ready yet, so coffee would have to be had in the kitchen. And it's cozier there, she added, and it's 2 steps from here to the pastry shop, so I bought an amazing cake. You take a walk around, see if you have any requests. And I'll call you to the table in 10 minutes. Miranda was alone with the house. Her first impression was that the place was always in semi-darkness. Peggy Urton could talk all she wanted about the crystal chandeliers and the fireplace, but even on a sunny day, the rays wouldn't reach here. Most of the windows faced north, and the shutters, and the lilac bushes, and the mezzanine balcony ... In short, it was dark without artificial light. Miranda went out into the hallway to find where the kitchen was. Suddenly she was overtaken by that distinctive smell. The smell of the circus. The smell of horse sweat. The tart smell of predators. Fresh sawdust, butterscotch, and baked goods. There was no smell of risk or applause. Miranda tried to figure out where the smell was coming from. How could it be if the painters had recently left the house? She opened one door after another and then stopped at the threshold of a small closet. Here she saw scraps of playbills on the floor, a pile of brightly colored costumes, some strange black hat, a makeup table. Miranda appealed to her sanity. Was it conceivable for Peggy Urton to keep all this stuff, not throw it away? After all, from her point of view, it was junk. Miranda blinked. The closet was empty. It hadn't been renovated, but there was no beggar here, except for the shabby walls, the board floor, and a window in the ceiling so narrow a cat couldn't fit through. The odor was much fainter now. She put her palms to her nose, and sure enough, she had just used them to grasp the door handle. She had just used them to grasp the doorknob. The odor was still there, so she had to wash her hands immediately. The bathtub was quickly found. Barbara Taylor had already had her hands in it, the ornate tile, the modern sink, the lighted mirror. Miranda shook the water off her hands and looked down at herself, petrified. A skull was staring straight into her eyes, empty black eye sockets. Not a human skull, a dog skull, and the mirror didn't show the bathroom itself. Just the skull, just darkness. Miranda not only clamped her eyes shut, she covered her face with her hands. She was afraid the skull would speak to her, and the sounds would be like a voice or a bark. When she opened her eyes, she could still see the terrible vision fading away. It gave way to her own face, deathly pale with widened eyes. Where did you disappear to? My mother-in-law was standing on the doorstep, the coffee's getting cold. My God, it's as if you've seen a ghost. Come with me, I'll give you some drops. After escaping from confinement, Jeremy ended up in an orphanage. Not right away, of course. First he tried to find his parents, and for that he had to get from the other side of the country to his hometown. He had no experience of homelessness, and he had never had to worry about food or lodging before. So Jeremy had a hard time, but somewhere hitchhiking, perfecting himself in inventing pathetic stories that could touch the harsh truckers, he still reached his home. And he learned that his mother and father no longer lived there. The father died soon after the disappearance of his son, and where the mother could have gone the neighbors did not even guess. The woman didn't share her plans with them. Maybe she could no longer see the house, where everything reminded her of her family, and if so, she probably changed the city too. He could have kept looking, but it was winter, and Jeremy was so exhausted and depleted that he acted foolishly, without thinking of the consequences. He slept in the cellars, if he could get into them, and he scrounged whatever food he could get. For example, he would go into the bistro, and while the tables were still being cleared, he would snatch a piece of bread that had been forgotten, or a pie that had not been eaten. He wore himself to rags and eventually ended up in the police station, and from there, in an orphanage. Hungry and struggling to survive. Jeremy didn't notice that he had lost his gift, and if he had, he wouldn't have regretted it. After the way fate had treated him, he considered the gift a curse and was glad to be rid of it. But it turned out that his ability to read other people's thoughts did not disappear, but as if hibernated in hard times. And as soon as the boy warmed up and ate a little, everything came back. But now Jeremy knew that he had to treat his gift as if it were a potent substance, use it only when it was absolutely necessary. And he had to hide his gift from others so that no one would even realize it. Jeremy was fortunate in that he'd come to the orphanage after he'd mourned his parents, and he was sure he'd never find his mother. Either his tears had dried up forever. Neither sentimentality nor self-pity was in him anymore, but he was always waiting for the next blow of fate, and was ready to respond to it, at least with sharp, boyish fists. And it paid off. In the orphanage, he was not bullied, he was not mocked. On the contrary, he even earned some respect. Everyone knew that he had no relatives, that he had been vagabonding for a long time. Usually such kids are not interested in studying. Sometimes they can hardly even read. Jeremy pounced on the science, as if he knew he needed it, that he couldn't do without it. The boys tried to tease him, they trumped him with their ability to sass the teacher. But Jeremy cut off such taunts at once. He began with a florid phrase, almost entirely made up of foul words. It was an invitation to be listened to. And then he said he wasn't going to work a penny job or drink himself to death. Life owes me a lot, he teased. Spitting through a knocked-out tooth was convenient. But what even the teachers, accustomed to their pups going to college at best, didn't expect was that Jeremy applied to medical school and passed the competition. There was no one around him with whom he could share his designs. "You'll learn, biology teacher. You're good. We'll be treated by you later." And Jeremy wanted to deal with the superpowers of man, and to understand what nature gave him, and what these terrible people, who almost broke his life, hoped to get from him. His brain was designed for scientific work. None of his classmates had such a tenacious memory, such a pronounced ability to generalize and analyze. And in his senior year, his mentors had already said definitely that Jeremy had a place in graduate school, that he should think about a PhD. As he had no one to support him, he worked part-time at the hospital in his spare time. He did not want to stay in a hostel, and as soon as the opportunity arose, he rented an apartment. That was the beginning of his library and card catalog. He collected very specific things. There was a lot written on the subject that interested him, but he did not want to chase sensation but facts. And also he was tracing the path of the very circus that seemed immortal. One could leaf through old newspapers, go deeper and deeper into the past, and be convinced the troupe existed even then. It kept traveling around the world. But at the same time it described a circle, invariably at regular intervals, returning to the same city. And the circusmen stayed there not in hotels, not in the most run-down motels. The same house beckoned them, as if it were their own. They put their carriages in its yard, and from here they started their new wanderings around the world. More and more often the Ouroboros came to Jeremy's mind, the most ancient symbol, the snake biting its tail, the alternation of creation and destruction, life and death, the beginning of a new cycle. And if he mosaicked all the evidence he had gathered, if he could believe the picture, it was only a matter of time before the new cycle began. In a short time they would be there again, in that town, near that house. It was frightening to think about. I wondered if that girl who had saved him back then had survived. Jeremy thought of her from time to time. He hoped she hadn't had to pay for it. But himself, was he still so attractive to them, to this traveling troupe? He felt he was. Which meant he had to go there to test a hunch. And to do that, he needed the circus people to know where he was. This whole thing was a hell of a bait and switch. He knew he'd get drunk, but it had to be done thoughtfully, to get to that point that only you can feel, when the fear that my mom that was a century ago called ugly recedes. Instead of fear comes the feeling that now, as in some game, you are going to take up a sword and go to crush your enemies left and right, not thinking that you yourself might fall from a dashing blow. He needed that kick from his subconscious to cross a line he'd been afraid to think about before. And at the same time, he didn't want to get so full that there would be a feeling of swings, and he'd be dizzy, and the fear would be replaced by despair at his own helplessness. Apparently, the higher powers decided that he was doing the right thing, because the hotel was found instantly. And according to the map, it was near the train station. It didn't matter to Jeremy what conditions he would live in. If he was alive in a few days, he would leave this city and try to forget it forever. And if he had nightmares in his sleep, it wouldn't be a lousy number. He threw his bag on the bed, locked the door again, and went to find a bar where he could sit for a long time without being disturbed. A boulevard crossing the center of the city started from the station square. Everything here was so bright, so light, so benign, and so far from what his soul was full of. Two white trees like emerald candles, beds of roses, souvenir stands. He peered around the bar with the kind of painful scrutiny that a sick man would look for in a drugstore. At last he caught sight of the basement. The heavy door at this hour of the morning was open to his surprise, and he hurried downstairs. And in the cool, semi-darkness of the place, you couldn't tell the day was just beginning. Not a single customer yet. Jeremy was the first. He chose a table in the far corner, asked the bartender to open a bottle of whiskey, and bring some kind of appetizer. He thought he'd learned to control himself. But the whiskey had come earlier, and Jeremy poured himself a bottle of whiskey, so much so that the bartender would have called it not a double but a quintuple whiskey, and drank it like water. That's what he'd come to. It was only then that he let go a little, the tight knot of fear loosened, and he could breathe. The waitress came over and put a plate of sausage and breadcrumbs in front of him. There's nothing else. He heard her apologetic tone and thought he should pay at once. He didn't know how his sit-down was going to end. The girl immediately understood his gesture. It meant both no change and get out of here. It seemed like an hour or more had passed. Jeremy was sipping his whiskey now and thinking about the fact that there was no way he was going to be able to play in the open. The odds were too unequal, and there was very little chance that the trap he had planned would work. He realized that this time he was risking not his freedom, but his life. And these creatures were capable of such a thing that death would seem like deliverance. Someone sat down across from him, and Jeremy looked up. It was a girl, very young, in a blue dress. She kept her eyes on him, and he thought the waitress had called her. Maybe she felt sorry for him. From the outside, he must have epitomized bitter loneliness. Or maybe she thought he was a tempting prey, easy to get her hands on for money. "Would you like a drink?" he asked the girl. "Then get yourself a glass." It seemed to him that everyone now wanted to escape the madness of the big by immersing themselves in the small. The girl drank and said something to him, touching his hand lightly. And she was sneaking sausage off the plate, sneaking it, trying to be sneaky. She wanted to look pretty, but she was probably very hungry. Jeremy could see that she was trying to please him. For the first time in a long time, he looked with that attentive gaze in which his gift was awakening. Yeah, she was living on a shoestring. She rented a room for two with a friend and spent the money she earned on clothes. After her poverty-stricken childhood, she was attracted to every brightly colored rag. She couldn't get enough of everything. Now she needed shoes, pink, high heels. But she really liked him young, nice-looking, not pushy. He had to go, damn it, he had to go. He took 2 red bills out of his wallet, placed them on the table, and then took the girl's hand and put her palm down on the bills. "Kathleen," he said, "buy yourself some shoes." He patted her shoulder a little and went on his way, ignoring her shocked face. He knew the address, and it appeared that it was the same boulevard he had to follow all the way to the end. A streetcar rang on his right hand. Here was a photographer, laying out national costumes on a bench, waiting for customers. A store selling shawarma and chibareks. An old building of a polyclinic. Fountains. The boulevard rose upward, and every now and then the level path was replaced by steps, and one could not sink into deep reverie as he wished. One had to remember not to stumble. Finally, when he couldn't wait any longer, Jeremy sighed a deep, convulsive sigh. Shoving his hands in his pockets, he walked toward the house. Toward the house. He expected to find the place dilapidated and desolate, but he stopped in amazement. The house had clearly become truly residential, and the new owner had decided to make it as good as any. The white plastic windows seemed decidedly out of harmony with the brick, which was not even 100 years old. He also noticed the curtains obviously new. What is this doing? Jeremy looked around, as if he wanted to call the people around him as witnesses. He noticed the old man next door, who was looking at him with his eyes shaded from the sun. "No one's home," said the old man. "The landlady hasn't come yet." Jeremy realized that the conversation might be a respite for him, and walked over to the fence that separated 1 yard from the other. "Who's the hostess?" "You don't know." Now the old man's look was suspicious. "What's the matter? Do you want to buy a house?" Not exactly well how, in fact, was to explain everything to an ignorant person. In a few days about here, I have to meet friends. They know the landlady well, and I just arrived earlier. So you're a guest? The old man went on inquiring. His eyebrows were white and bushy, which made him look menacing. Children are afraid of such old men. Have you come to visit? Sort of. Can you tell me a little bit about the missus? I don't like gossip. The old man wanted to get back to his business. But he said, especially in this house, gossiping is not worth it. And that was a clue to a new conversation. Because after those words, Jeremy couldn't move away from the fence. No amount of force would make him. I hear there are some bad things going on in this house, he said casually. Heard from where? From whom? And again the look of those blue eyes, so bright they seemed icy. But hell, he couldn't tell the old man that this house is a kind of dining room for ... After that, the neighbor. If he says anything, it will be on the phone. Dialing 03, come here. There's a psycho. Take him away before he makes trouble. I used to live in this town, Jeremy said with the look of a man in a hurry who wanted to talk. And I remember the circus used to stop here. Right on this lawn. But these words of the old man were unexpectedly convincing. Who indeed could have known about it except the old-timer? It was a long time ago. You must have been very young. How can you not remember ... We here, everyone who lives around here were afraid that these lunatics would do something crazy. They'd get drunk, set fire to something drunk, God forbid. They'd get into a fight. They didn't. In general, the circus has come here twice in my memory. Jeremy raised his eyebrows in surprise. Yeah, that's the case you were talking about. That was 25 years ago. And before that you still have to measure a quarter. You weren't around then, but I was then, like you are now. Well, it's been 25 years again. Maybe they'll come again. They will, Jeremy said thoughtfully, yet confidently. They can't not come. I was surprised it had been so long, and I thought the house had been torn down. At that time it was ownerless. You can't tear this house down that easily. He is himself, but the old man did not continue. Were you inside? Jeremy knew he had been, but he could only read his mind when the old man started to remember. And the old man told him that it was strange. For many years he had never established such a relationship with any of the inhabitants of the house that he could easily visit each other. It's like a kaleidoscope. Some lived there, then others I can't remember them all. Once a young couple asked me to feed their cat. They left me the key. They were going somewhere. I went and fed it ... Well, it's all right. The old man's gesture begone was completely unexpected. Jeremy flinched. What is it? On the third day, a cat went missing. He disappeared from a locked house. I wanted to give up myself by then. It seems like everything is normal around there. Well, the most ordinary things. But when you walk around the rooms, you start to see the hell of what you see. I've never suffered from nerves. But this is not good at all. There's no animal, that's all. And all the windows are closed. I think, how will I report to the young ones? And they didn't come back. They left, and that was the end of it. I've kept the key to the house ever since. No one's ever asked me for it. The new owners must have changed the lock. It's not the main door, not the front door, but the back door. I see. And tell me about the last hostess. Jeremy knew that a house could change hands in many ways, but only its true owners could pass it on. It's just a girl, Miranda. She inherited it. Only she gave it to her mother-in-law right away. She's the one who's been renovating it. Young people don't need all that. The land, greenhouses. They're not ready to put down roots yet. They've got wind in their heads, going here and there. My mother-in-law doesn't live here yet, but she'll probably move in soon. She's already brought some potted flowers. I don't think they'll survive here. There's not enough light. You wouldn't happen to know how to find Miranda, would you? The old man shrugged. I think she works at a maternity hospital. And there's only one in town. But I can't say for sure whether she is there or not. All the same, Jeremy shook the old man's hand sincerely. Thank you very much. The ... He was lucky the second time, which was much more important. The first time he'd found a suitable hotel at the first request, and there was room. And now, when he looked up the phone number of the maternity hospital on the internet and asked for Miranda, a girl came up. As soon as he started talking about the house, he knew from her startled silence that it was her. Can I meet you? he asked. Jeremy was prepared for Miranda to refuse him, and then he'd come to her in the hospital and lay down his life, but she'd listen to him. The girl doesn't realize that she's destined to be the bloody delicatessen at the meal that's already in progress. And only if they act together will she have a chance. His own chance will increase a little. But there's no risk. What do you want to tell me? Heard Jeremy. Please ... preferably today ... pick any place that is convenient for you. I'll take half an hour tops. She must have heard the pleading intonations in his voice, was silent for a few moments, and then said with determination, "Good. There's a little cafe near this house. I'll meet you there. At 4 o'clock. ... Miranda was almost half an hour late. It wasn't much longer. Sometimes her husband had to wait for her until late in the evening. That meant another woman in labor wasn't doing so well. But now she was standing in this small cafe, which was more like a diner, and squinting at the room. Who should recognize whom, he, her, or she, him? She wondered later how she could have thought she wouldn't recognize him at once. A young man was sitting by the window. At first she wondered if there was a movie being filmed somewhere. He looked like the hero of a movie from the 50s. A light-colored coat, dark hair, thin features. And yes, it was him. The same one who had been coming to her in her deepest deaf dreams for many years. He raised his head. He saw at once the picture that stood before her eyes. He's small, dirty, exhausted in a cage, and she, pushing on the bolt. They looked at each other, and not a single word was spoken. But they talked. It can't be. It can't be that you got this house. I'm sure this inheritance is from her. She's the one who said, "You'll remember my gift." Do you know what that means? Yeah, and I don't hold out much hope of surviving. This house is a monster. You should hear it when you walk through it, the way it crunches. It's like it's kneading its bones, stretching, smelling you. A waitress came to their table, and both of them had to return to reality. Miranda wondered what the girl thought of them. They looked like a strange couple with their silent game. Without taking her eyes off Jeremy, she took the menu. Still, she had to make an effort. Tattered pages and worn plastic. Miranda thought her friend must be hungry. She was suddenly hungry too. And that was a sure sign that, despite the approaching danger, she felt a kind of confidence. Usually when she was worried, she had no appetite. But now she wasn't alone. Bring us dumplings. With broth? With sour cream? With tomato? 2 double servings. And a cup of sour cream each. They didn't notice whether they had waited long enough to order. They had too much to say to each other. How have you been living? You're asking me if I've ever forgotten that. Oh yeah. Dreams? In the orphanage they said that I often scream in my sleep. The boys used to wake me up ... when I started studying at the institute. I got hooked on pills. Antidepressants? Yeah. Chuckles. Are you married? How could I get married if I waited every day for them to get to me? They come out of nowhere. If an outsider saw all this, they'd go crazy. We didn't go crazy because we were kids. Kids are more flexible. So no wife. And I don't have kids for the same reason. They glanced over with a bitter smile of equals. Were you really hoping this would all be over for you if you gave the house to your mother-in-law? It hung on me like a weight, she admitted. I wouldn't have taken it at all, mine made me. And I also tried to talk myself into it. How do I know it was her gift? And when I went in there, I realized the house couldn't be anything else. It smells like them. They're beasts, their sweat and their powder. And I'm the only one who smells it, no one else. In everyone's eyes were crazy. They brought the dumplings. Steam was still rising above them. The smell of meat and bay leaf interrupted the memories of the terrible. Both of them gorged themselves on the food. I've tried to forget, she said when her plate was empty, have you? And I tried to learn everything I could about them. Because the day would come, the hour would come, and then there would be no getting away from it. I didn't want to be taken warm. Then explain to me. He shook his head. Don't ask me how old they are, I don't know. Some of it I had to gather from bits and pieces, some of it is speculation. Sometimes I think they're as old as the earth. Sometimes I think they come from somewhere in the Middle Ages, when people's fears materialized. And where they are now, I don't know either. Then why did you, We'll draw them up, he said, Or would you try to run away? I shouldn't. You're still so young. You'll suffer for a long time. And in the end, fear will suffocate you anyway. And how do you think you're going to lure them in? Instead of answering, he closed his eyes. It was easy to do, to be in the cage he remembered, down to every scratch on the iron bars, every crevice in the floorboards. He remembered how many steps along, across, and askew. On the crevice that blew him especially hard on cold days. He would have gnawed out a loophole to escape, but they guarded not only his body but his thoughts, which was far worse. And when this girl opened the door for him, he concentrated on not thinking not about anything else, only the pain from the nails digging into his palms. But as he gathered on the internet, in libraries, in bookstores, everything that might have touched them, he called on his memory again, painful though it was. But it required separating the grain from the chaff. Figuring out what was true and what was false in memory was the only thing he could rely on. He knew them too well to take certain things on faith. You're weaker than I am, he said. You hear only my thoughts and I hear everyone's. But now they're onto you. Maybe it's just revenge. Oh, they're very vindictive. Or maybe they're just hungry. This house isn't the only one. And when they get hungry, they wander into one of the houses like people wander into a diner. Usually it's on a harvest day an hour. This time they'll come for you, but if they know I'm here, they'll come early. Aye, she asked a little audibly. And we'll have to make sure the house wakes up early too, so that it will take them, not us, for food. She shook her head fearfully. You're groping. You're not sure of anything. And we're risking too much. You won't get another chance. Do you have the key to the house? I gave everything to my mother-in-law. I can't go to the house alone. She'll definitely follow me. Luckily, my neighbor still has the key. He's had it for ages, but maybe the lock hasn't been changed. Let's go check it out. They were indeed hungry, but only those who knew their true nature could see that. To everyone else, they were just ordinary people who met twice a day at a common table in the caravan, where EVA lived. In the mornings they drank tea, and in the evenings after the shows they stayed up late, the smell of charcoal grilled meat stirring the nostrils of passers-by. But a knowledgeable person would have noticed the twitching of their hands, which had suddenly become dry, the wrinkles on their faces, and the light that sometimes flashed in their eyes. They knew that when they were truly satiated, they would get rid of the signs of age and the hunger that tormented them from within. But they sometimes had to endure long enough, for not every prey was suitable. The prey had to be different from the human herd, and it was not always possible to find a suitable one. Immortality comes at a high price, and not everyone could withstand it. There used to be more of them, many more, but some had fallen behind along the way. This Vera ... she'd asked to be let go, to be left to live near one of their houses. What the hell she was eating there, picking up scum. No wonder she eventually grew old and died. Eve felt her death. She was the most empathetic of them all, always knowing exactly what they needed and how they could get it. So it came naturally that she became senior to them. But never had she met such an attractive prey as that boy. That was why no one dared to infringe on his life. Their power multiplied with him, and he was bound to become one of them sooner or later, if he hadn't escaped. Now they will have to settle for less, much less. Vera is gone, and now their cottage belongs to someone else ... Well, happiness for the owners if they don't mess around. Can you feel it? Miranda asked as they entered the house. Jeremy made a sign with his hand to wait. He stepped as carefully as if he were walking on a taut wire, carefully calibrating his every step, holding his breath. He was afraid to disturb, to wake the house before its time. And yet it seemed to Miranda that something was already beginning to happen. The air wavered slightly, as it would over a campfire. The floorboards crackled a little louder, and the floor seemed to waver slightly. Then Jeremy couldn't stand it, pointed to the new window and raised his eyebrows slightly. It's the mother-in-law, Miranda whispered hastily. She's in charge of all the changes around here. I wonder how the house didn't chew her arm off. She is so mediocre that she was probably of no interest to him. And they managed to get the key without any problems. The old man even followed them to see if the young men could open the back door. He had kept the key for so many years, and he was curious. Jeremy saw at once that the key would fit. It slid into the keyhole so easily that it turned on its own. The old man left, and they entered the house. Here not only did the corridor that ran through the entire mansion begin. From here, from the back door, Stone steps led down to the cellar. That's where they both went down in the first place. Of course, Peggy Urton, with her great household plans, couldn't help getting to this corner of the house. The cellar was empty, the workmen having removed all the junk that had accumulated there over the years. And the shelving units they'd ordered hadn't arrived yet. Just a dungeon, just a crypt. A ray of light, which seemed blue, fell from a narrow window in the ceiling. Jeremy stood a few feet from the window, his head up. The light had transformed his face. Too, it had lost its natural color, drenched in that dead blue. Jeremy closed his eyes and whispered something inaudible. Miranda realized that the irreversible was happening now. He was calling out to them, and he seemed to have succeeded in reaching their minds. Then he opened his eyes and turned to Miranda, but his gaze was crazy, like that of a frightened child. She took both his hands. "Did you succeed?" He tried to swallow. It didn't work on the first try. "They'll be here tomorrow night." "And what are they?" "They can't believe their happiness." Peggy Urton ventured to spend the first night in her new home. Her bedroom had been ready for a long time. But to be honest, the new owner had dreamed of doing things differently. To organize a housewarming party, to invite her friends, and after a noisy feast, scattered among the rooms to sleep soundly and without dreams. It was a little scary to be alone. But the party was postponed. That friend, without whom it made no sense to organize all this, went to her daughter, and for a long time. She would be back in a month at the earliest, and Peggy Urton couldn't wait that long. "I'm as curious as Eve," she liked to say on every occasion. And now she convinced herself that there was nothing to be afraid of, that this was not some forgotten corner. This was a city, and there were people on the right and on the left. Of course, no one would dare to rob a mansion. It was not like robbing a cottage. But she chided herself for not ordering bars for the windows, and decided to do it soon. She arrived at her new home without telling her son or his wife, with a light load in her hands and a bad headache. She arrived that very evening, a couple hours before sunset. She'd been thinking since morning that she'd make a feast for herself, fry some chops while singing, open some wine. But now the thought of food made her sick. Peggy Urton dropped 2 green pills into the palm of her hand and took a drink of tap water. She thought for a moment and added another pill, for her blood pressure, just in case. Wrinkling her nose and putting her fingers to her temples, it was a little cold in the house, and her hands were still icy. She made her way to the bedroom, lay down, and covered herself with a downy shawl. She expected the pain to continue for a long time, but it suddenly receded, and unnoticed, Peggy Urton fell asleep. "They're sure it'll be business as usual," Jeremy said as they settled by the window. "After all, the deadline, 25 years, is only a few days away. That's why they'll come in to get us, you can be sure of it. They're getting close." Miranda didn't ask now if he'd succeeded in waking the house. She could sense that he was almost awake. The visions that tormented her became brighter. They flashed in succession. Wherever she looked, she saw the victims, their last moments, while for the house itself they were memories pleasant to the point of shivering, gastronomic. Miranda tried to look only at Jeremy. He was her only hope of getting out of here alive. "Why did you become a midwife?" he asked suddenly. "Ever since I've been there, I've just carried the breath of death with me," she said simply. "I wanted to be closer to the birth of life. Displace it, did you? And I wanted to know what kind of power I had been given. Why am I like this? Are there others like me?" They were silent. Maybe it lasted a long time, maybe a few moments. Something warm and sticky dripped down Miranda's cheek. She tried to wipe it away and suddenly realized. The house is drooling. You could hear the panic in her whisper. Instead of answering, he pointed to the window. She didn't understand at first, and then she was numb. There was a lawn in front of the house, lit by the light of lanterns, and there were shadows moving across it. Those tales of the unclean, which seemed so faded and naive now, assured her that the undead didn't reflect in mirrors or give shadows. But now they saw with their own eyes no people, just shadows on the grass. Here a man in a hat, here a woman in a long dress, an old woman with a beak, and more women, and men. Men. The shadows flocked to the front door, which was thoughtfully ajar. Peggy Urton woke up with a pounding heart, as if she'd had a nightmare. She didn't remember the plot of the dream, though, and she didn't understand what there was to be afraid of, but the feeling of dread wouldn't go away. She reached for the phone on the nightstand and turned it on to see what time it was. It showed that she had slept for only a little while, about 2 hours. Everything looked so calm. Moonlight was pouring in through the window, no noise. She was surrounded by things that she herself had chosen in the stores, then commanded the movers who brought them in and arranged them. There was no one and nothing foreign, nothing alien in her room. Only shadows lay on the floor, special nocturnal shadows. But should one be afraid of shadows? And yet something was happening. She looked closely and listened. Everything shook slightly. It couldn't have been an earthquake, for it had never happened in their land. It sounded more like the shaking of a horse that couldn't wait to get out of its seat. Peggy Urton hastily put on her glasses, raked her dressing gown from the chair. She never had premonitions, nor did she believe in them. But the feeling that came over her was so strong, so primal, that she could not help obeying it. Where are those damn slippers? And what on earth is going on, gentlemen? What is it? Miranda whispered. Why did they come dressed like that? She could see sadness, if not doom, in Jeremy's gaze, but his voice was as firm as ever. Maybe he wanted to reassure her with that tone. Like this? Because they've come for us, and no one else is supposed to see them. What do they want to do with us? And I don't know about me, but they want you alive. Not anymore. I mean alive not in the sense that you and I understand it. Most likely they want to make me one of them. But first. I read how they take people. True. It's a legend, but what can we rely on but legends? Nothing else. First, they become our shadows. Can we escape our own shadows? Never. Only the shadow follows the man, but now it will be the other way around. We will have to follow them. But you don't, do you? It's not, is it? Let's run to the basement. Hurry. They shouldn't have been able to turn on the lights, and there shouldn't have been the slightest noise from them. What force helped them not to trip on the steps? Jeremy held Miranda's hand tightly by the wrist. That's how you hold babies. Only the walls flashed. If the house really was surrounded on all sides, it would be a total failure. But they were lucky when they ran up the steps to the back door and opened it. There was nothing but lawn in front of them. The lawn, which here was lighted only by the moon, and the darkening garden beyond it. One last dash. When they reached the lilac bushes, they took cover behind them. Now watch what happens, Jeremy said quietly. She could rather read it on his lips. But what if things don't go your way? If the house is with them? He shrugged. There's nothing more we can do anyway. Several endless languid moments passed. Maybe during this time the circus ghosts were searching the house? And then, Miranda and Jeremy were startled by a sharp bang. It was the front door slamming shut. Then the blows came one after another, but not as hard. It was the slamming of the shutters on the windows. The house clenched its jaws. If someone stood watching the ancient mansion from across the street at this late-night hour, they would probably think they were hallucinating. It was like a stereo picture. When a kind of miracle happens before your eyes, the perspective changes, and you see something no one else sees. The house stood still, but there, inside it, some living organism was clenching its teeth. Huge jaws were walking. Someone invisible was satisfying a fierce hunger. In vain, the prey battered at the closed windows and doors. The desperate screams were silent to everyone, almost everyone. Only the couple hiding in the lilac bushes behind the house could hear them. Miranda fell to the grass, covering her ears with her hands. She was used to the screams of women in labor, but she couldn't hear these undead cries. Look at the smoke, she heard Jeremy's voice. Overcoming herself, she raised her head. No one would flood the boiler in the summer. Only in mid-autumn would you see smoke rising from the chimneys above the roofs. But over this house there was smoke. Thick pink changed to red, the color of fire, or blood. The smoke rose to the sky and melted into it. Are we the only ones seeing this too? Or are the neighbors calling the fire department now? Jeremy didn't answer her question. He couldn't take his eyes off the frightening and mesmerizing sight. It took quite some time before the screams subsided. Here was the last faint moan and a ringing silence. The smoke had dried up. And then, Miranda was ready to wipe her eyes. But it wasn't imagined, it was really happening. Right before her eyes, the house began to deteriorate, returning to its true age. Cracks ran down the white walls, the whiteness darkening into a dirty gray. The roof was decrepit, and in some places holes appeared in it. instead of the now empty black openings, like eye sockets in a decaying skull. The door snapped and hung on one hinge. The outbuilding collapsed, but silently, as if in a silent movie. Now the house in front of them was not a house, but a ruin that was God knows how old. Yin and yang, Ouroboros biting itself by the tail. Everything in the world is interconnected, and the end of one thing becomes the beginning of another, and the beginning inevitably leads to the end. What did it all mean? Miranda felt like she was teetering on the brink of losing her mind. "They're not coming back," Jeremy rose with such difficulty, as if he were as old as these ruins. "It seems they can't exist without each other." The house was too hungry, and his hosts came in handy. They were its last meal. It's all over now. But Miranda couldn't get up. She had no strength. She sat on the ground, ruffling her hair with her hands, which were shaking. She couldn't even cry from the shock. But they heard the crying. A normal human cry. A woman's bitter. "Who's that?" "Neighbors?" Jeremy held out his hand to Miranda and helped her up. A woman stood a few steps away from the house. A heavy figure, robe and barefoot slippers. Miranda squinted, something familiar to her. "Wait, there's no way." "Elena? What brings Peggy here?" "Who?" "My mother-in-law." Miranda let go of Jeremy's hand and ran awkwardly, as if her legs weren't quite right yet. Yes, it was Peggy Urton. She stood there sobbing, putting her fists in her mouth, probably to keep from howling. "What is it? What is it?" she repeated. "How did you get here?" The women, young and old, stood a stone's throw from each other. "Why? The gas couldn't have exploded in here, could it? Why did the whole place collapse?" Peggy Urton was as confused as a small child. "You guys slept here?" Miranda finally got the message. The mother-in-law nodded shallowly. The first night. Rejoice that you made it out in time, that you're alive." Miranda took hold of her head again. "God, they almost killed Vitya's mother. Tell me, did you destroy this place? Maybe you regretted writing the deed of gift to me. You thought you didn't want me to have the house? Why would you do that? Why ruin everything? I mean, it would have gone to you in the end." Miranda looked at her mother-in-law with wide eyes and couldn't understand what she was asking her. "So it's you." Peggy was already howling. "Do you think I'm what?" Miranda covered her eyes. "Breathe," she told herself. She had to focus on breathing, or she would collapse right now, right here, just like these walls. This night had cost her too much. The street was no longer quiet. Late passers-by, neighbors running out of their houses. Some were aghast, some were filming the ruins of the house on their phones. Some were calling and demanding to send rescuers and an ambulance. The "why call anyone now?" The voices were humming, merging into the steady noise of a swarm of bees. Miranda looked back. The clearing behind her was empty. Only the moon, the grass, and the shadows of the sprawling lilac bushes. "So how did it end?" Jeremy asked. "We sold the plot." "And they sold it very well." William finally got involved. "The place is golden." They grabbed the land with their hands. "Of course, everything here will be demolished. The new owner will build." "En knew Hosea," and Jeremy said the words, almost syllabically, emphasizing the last one. "A very down-to-earth man. He has his own business. He drills wells for people. And he has a big family, a wife and 4 sons. The boys will be out there racing in the garden with their dog. And we bought my mother-in-law a summer house. She cried so much her dream was gone, and all her savings. She spent everything for this house. Her credit card is bare now. She sold her shares. She told us I'd become a beggar. So William picked out a big house for her, big enough for all her friends. I think she's a bit relieved now." Jeremy nodded. They stood at the bus station, waiting for his bus to arrive. He'd wanted to leave yesterday, but Miranda had asked him to wait a day. She wanted to say goodbye to him. She had been on night duty the night before, and now she came running straight from the hospital, tortured. He knew those sunken, and yet somehow peculiarly shining eyes a sign of long sleeplessness and of the fact that the hard duty had ended well. "Why don't you stay?" she repeated for the 1,500th time. They both knew that he had no one to rush to accept his patience. And they also knew the axiom that he could only stay if they were together. Otherwise, tearing up his soul. It's even harder than fighting ghosts. Shadows. And there was only one moment when he asked her that question, with his eyes. It didn't require a mental conversation, just a look. Do you love me? Will you go away with me, he asked. Her answering look expressed both struggle and anguish at the same time, and that was enough. He couldn't hurt her. She had a debt to the man who had once saved her, and who had taken care of her all these years. The heavy bus slowly pulled out of the parking lot, pulled up to the platform. The doors opened. Go on. Take the window seat. Jeremy put his arms around her and pulled her against him. They stood like that, swaying slightly. She closed her eyes. Never had she felt so peaceful and blissful. Never. Not even in the cradle. You promise? Do you remember? They had said it almost simultaneously. Now they were looking at each other. He wiped the tears from her cheeks with his palm. If ever, anything else ... this devil's circus is similar ... if, even just a premonition. I'll call you. I'll be there. I promise. I remember. He pulled away so gently that she didn't feel it right away. She saw him coming up the steps to the bus. ... It was over. But there was still eternity, the one where evil is only an accident, and where there is no fear of losing each other, for their two souls can become one.